don't hit that skip button because I have huge news for you. The Rewind of the Living Dead t shirt lives. It is here. It is available to purchase. Oh, yes, I'm not kidding. We finally got our Rewind of the Living Dead t shirt out, and it's amazing. It is printed by the same company that prints for Cavity Colors and Fright Rags, which, if you're a hardcore horror fan who buys a lot of horror t shirts, I know I do, you know that's the very best and highest quality because we couldn't do anything less for our fans. It's an amazing full color design designed by Jason Ragosta. It's very cool. It features a zombified myself, a zombified Damon, and it looks just like an awesome horror shirt because that's what we want because we're horror fans too. So we wanted to make a t-shirt that you could really sink your teeth into. Go to rewindofthelivingdead.bigcartel.com. Again, that's rewindofthelivingdead.bigcartel.com to get your t-shirt today. Rewind of the Living Dead is a review show, so spoilers are ahead.
As we wrap up October, what better way to celebrate horror fans' favorite month than with a classic double feature? Over on Amazon, Blumhouse produced a new horror comedy starring Kiernan Shipka as a teenager sent back through time in an effort to save her mother after she was murdered by a mass serial killer that took out 3 of her best friends 35 years earlier. Meanwhile, video game adaptations into films are nothing new, but this year brought to life a hugely popular franchise created by Scott Cawthon about a security guard hired to keep an eye on a creepy abandoned restaurant that just so happens to be inhabited by a group of possessed animatronic mascots that come out to play at night. In the latest episode of Rewind of the Living Dead, we present a special double feature as we review the new films Totally Killer and Five Nights at Freddy's. Welcome back to Rewind of the Living Dead. I'm Damon Martin.
And I'm Old Man Guerra.
And this week, Patrick, what better way to wrap up October? As I mentioned in the intro, it's Halloween month, and we were trying to decide how to go out this month, and our original plan was just to review Five Nights at Freddy's, which is a new film that just dropped, which we'll talk about the blockbuster numbers this film earned in its opening weekend in a second. But we also had another film that came out this month that we just didn't get to because of everything else that happened with The Exorcist Believer and When Evil Lurks and other films we had going on, which was Totally Killer, which was a film that dropped on Amazon. It works out because both films are actually produced by Blumhouse. So we thought, why not close out our month with a double feature just like you would get on a classic Halloween night. You go to the drive-in, about 2/3 of our audience probably like, what the fuck's a drive-in? For the old people like us, go to a drive-in, you pop on a movie, and you see a classic double feature. That was what you did as a kid. So that's how we're closing out October, Patrick, with a double feature of Totally Killer and Five Nights at Freddy's.
You gotta love a good double feature. I mean, it's been a while since I've went to a good double feature. There's actually a drive-in right by my house. It's like literally around the corner, and they double feature all the time. Turns out actually like going to the drive-in kind of sucks. Like it's hard to see the screen. The sound isn't that great unless you have great car audio or whatever. But yeah, I'm sort of talking about old antiquated things, Damon, because I think that's how you and I is. I think we're like a little bit older than maybe the demographics that enjoy movies like Totally Killer and Five Nights at Freddy. That's why I introduced myself as Old Man Guerra this week, because I watch these two movies. I go, fuck, I'm getting old. Like I'm just getting old. And it has nothing to do with how I feel about the movies. It's just these movies skew for younger people. They're positioned for younger people to enjoy. Totally Killer, I think, definitely leans a little bit more towards our age range because of the nostalgia factor. It does take place, or at least in large part, in the 1980s. But basically what it was like, oh, what if we went back in time 35 years to the 80s? And you're like, ah, shit. That's when I was like running around thinking the world was the coolest place in the 1980s. And so we got characters in two different movies who are literally multiple generations ahead of us, Damon. It's rather frightening and humbling and promising all at once.
and depressing. Let's be honest. When they
Very.
when they do Totally Killer, and there's a part at the beginning of the movie where Kiernan Shipka's character goes, "Mom, it was 35 years ago," and I was like doing the math. I was like, "Oh my god, 35 years ago? That can't be right."
Yeah, it's like I remember, obviously you and I grew up watching Back to the Future, and in Back to the Future they go 35 years into the past. They go to 1955 or whatever. It's like 30 years earlier, and you're like, wow, look at that ancient time when people
Yeah.
were like at soda shops and like the way they dressed and all that stuff. That is literally the premise of Told to Killer, except the way back past is a past that I grew up in. And I'm like, oh shit, we're doing this now. We are now being faced with the idea that we are in fact getting old.
It's interesting because these two films are very dissimilar in some ways and very similar in other ways. The way I compare them in terms of similarity is that they both search for a certain audience with the filmmaking we get here. With Totally Killer, it is a horror comedy, so you're kind of branching out a little further than just the horror crowd. It is definitely, and as I said before, I don't particularly like the ironic horror comedies when it's so bad it's good, but when it's set up as a horror comedy, they can be great. I've loved, Zombieland, and we did a review for Mayhem a while back. Shaun of the Dead, we can go on, the list goes on forever for actual horror comedies that are great. And this is what Totally Killer is. Meanwhile, Five Nights at Freddy's is a film based on a video game, which is nothing really new. They've done it for many, many years. This is a hugely popular franchise, and once again, they're catering to a specific audience. The horror comedy crowd is one, of course, with that. Also, I think a little bit of the nostalgia crowd because the '80s,
Yeah.
the '80s do get a lot of love these days, especially with the explosion of Stranger Things and stuff like that. But again, this is a totally a new concept to go back to the '80s, which was a heyday for horror. And then with Five Nights at Freddy's, you've got your cooked in audience, your baked in audience with the video game crowd. Now, I want to open and talk about Five Nights at Freddy's because to be fair to this film, I'm not a big gamer these days. I used to play video games a lot years ago. I don't play anymore. I was familiar with the Five Nights at Freddy's games mostly because, and I know this sounds kind of funny, mostly because on the rarest of occasions that I find myself in a mall, which also sounds outdated, on the rarest occasions I would find myself in a mall and I might pop into a Hot Topic, they always had these big Five Nights at Freddy's displays. I didn't know what it was. I had no idea, and I figured out through just looking it up. It was a video game. Now to be fair, I'm not so old that I don't know big video game franchises. If you would have said The Last of Us before the show came out, which was another adaptation, I would have totally understood what it was. I knew what The Last of Us was long before the show came out, but I was not familiar with Five Nights at Freddy's. But these video game adaptations, Patrick, have happened for many, many years. I mean, we can go back to Super Mario Brothers had an adaptation. We can go to
Mortal Kombat.
Mortal Kombat had an adaptation. Of course, Resident Evil had an adaptation. There's a million of them out there. Some good, some bad. But I never understood the fandom surrounding Five Nights at Freddy's until I got an email today from Blumhouse. I'm on their press release list, and I got it. Listen to this. Let me lay this out to you, Patrick. Opening weekend for Five Nights at Freddy's. This is now the biggest Blumhouse global opening of all time, beating Halloween from 2018. It earned $91.8 million. It is the biggest opening for a horror film ever directed by a woman, Emma Tammy, who directed this project. This is actually the third time they've worked with her on a couple different films, but this is her first major film like this. Biggest opening ever for a woman. The highest grossing opening weekend for a Blumhouse, surpassing Halloween domestically, which is now $76.222 million. And it's the highest opening for any PG-13 horror film, surpassing The Mummy Returns, which had $68.139 million. Patrick, the numbers are staggering when you think about the records that this movie broke in the first weekend it's been out. And I knew there was a fandom for Five Nights at Freddy's. I understood that just getting into the trailers and seeing things about the movie. I did not understand how much people love this series.
Yeah, I was bowled over when I started seeing the numbers coming in. I think it had a $38 million Friday night, which I was like, that's kind of humongous. And I knew something was up because I went to go book. I ended up watching it home on Peacock, which it also had a day and date release, which is even more shocking. It's breaking records when it's being released at home and in theaters at the same time. So that should tell you something. But when I was going to book my tickets, there was like 60 showtimes at my theater. And I was like, that's a lot of show. That's like when Star Wars comes out, there's so many theaters playing it like every 90 minutes, is like tons of theaters playing it we have a 20 theater multiplex near my house, which you've been to with me a couple times. Tons and tons of showing. So I was like, I think they think this is going to be big. And again, old man Guerra didn't really know much about Five Nights at Freddy's. I knew it was a popular video game because my brother told me. Shout outs to Schwink. You can find him on social media. But he was like, yeah, it's a really popular game. I've never played it, but it's super popular. Damon, this movie opened higher than the Taylor Swift movie opened. And the Taylor Swift movie was like, here comes the Taylor Swift movie. Blumhouse literally moved Halloween and what was it? No, it was Exorcist Believer. They moved just to get out of the way of Taylor Swift because she was going to have this monstrous opening, and she did. Big numbers. And then a couple weeks later, she's unseated by a horror movie from a video game I've never really played or seen or have any idea what it's about at all. So I was like, wow, this is the first time in my life when I don't know shit about what is intensely popular. Like, I don't know dog shit about what this is. Like, I've understood, even if I don't listen to music like Taylor Swift, I've understood like who's popular and what's big. This just like hit me on the side of the face. I was like, it's that popular? That it's going to break records across the board in one weekend? Now, Damon, it's not all sunshine and roses. Critics have panned this movie. I mean, like, tanked it. But does that really matter? Now, the audience score, exit scores they take, were very high, whereas the critic scores were very low. I walked by somebody today at my mall where it was playing, and it was a large group of younger people, much younger than me. And they were like, "Did you see Five Nights at Freddy's?" They were all like, "Yes, yes, yes, yes." But it was all girls, by the way, which is another thing where I was like, "Well, I guess it's popular with girls too," because typically video games, they aren't these days. It's gotten way more democratized, but it used to skew very heavy male, not so much these days. So it was interesting to see a large group of girls all talking about Five Nights at Freddy's, and they were all like, "Yeah, I saw it, I saw it, I saw it," and then everyone just collectively went, "It fucking sucked," and I was like, okay, so what I'm more curious about is actually what next week is going to look like, what the drop off for Five Nights at Freddy's is going to look like. Because without any spoilers, Damon, I think this is a weirder, kind of looser podcast where we aren't going to really like dive deep into each of these stories because we're going to be doing a double feature. I'll be honest with you, Damon. I left the theater rather confused, and I thought it was because maybe I just have zero understanding of this franchise, and it turns out I don't. And I'm going to tell you why. So afterwards, I left the theater myself feeling, I watched it on Peacock. I was done, and I went, I don't know, I don't understand what I just watched. I really don't. So I looked it up. I started going on YouTube and like looking up Five Nights at Freddy's, and even, my kids even know about it. It's a very popular thing to look up on YouTube. And I looked up Five Nights at Freddy's lore, just the video game lore. It was equally confusing. Where I was and even the people explaining it kind of were having a hard time explaining it, at least in any sort of linear fashion. Like, I guess because of the structure of the video game, like things get peppered in and things get sort of like revealed to you in weird ways and not necessarily even in the same game. Um, and the movie to me, Damon. I'm going to say I just don't understand what about the movie I'm supposed to be attached to. Does that make sense? Like I didn't really latch onto this movie because I felt like it was an absolute like hodgepodge of things happening without anything of substance kind of being carried through the movie.
I understand what you're saying. I'll take it a step further and say my biggest issue with Five Nights at Freddy's, which by the way, why is it Five Nights at Freddy's? Like, I feel like it was just a play on alliteration to make it Five Nights at Freddy's to do the five Freddy's thing, because there's no reference to why we're having Five Nights at Freddy's. Like, do they actually spend 5 nights at Freddy's?
I think it was actually
It
five
was
full nights.
it
I
was
think
just
it
a
was.
weird. It was just a weird, like, that title to me was like, why is this in the title? Like, does something special happen on the fifth night? Anyways, um,
We're just sounding like confused old men.
I know. Here's the biggest issue with Five Nights at Freddy's, without getting into spoilers, but at least giving you some idea of what my biggest problem with the film is. It is a film. So you know me, Patrick. I am a plot heavy guy. I need a story. I've said this many, many times. Now, I admit there are films where the story isn't as deep or as rich, but it's just a really well done movie and I can still totally enjoy it. But by and large, I love a good story. Here's where I'll compare Five Nights at Freddy's to Totally Killer, the other film we're reviewing this week. Five Nights at Freddy's is a film that gets bogged down in way too much plot, way too much character development, or an attempt at character development.
Yeah.
And it gets away from the core theme of the movie, which is security guard at a haunted ass restaurant with animatronic puppets that are alive. That is what Five Nights at Freddy's is at its core, is what it's about. And I understand the story itself for the video game people out there. Yes, it does go deeper than that. I'm not dumb, but that is really where you're trying to get to. You're trying to get to Freddy Fazbear's restaurant, the security guard Mike, and the creepy ass haunted puppets or animatronics, whatever you want to call them. It gets so bogged down in story trying to get there, and then it feels like we really don't even spend a lot of time there, to be honest, like in terms of like the rest of the time we spend outside of the restaurant.
Yeah.
Where Totally Killer nails it. And I texted you this the night I saw Totally Killer, and then you watched it, I think, the next night. And this is going back a couple of weeks. And I just rewatched it last night to get geared up for this podcast because I saw it when it first came out. I think it came out like on October 10th or something like that. And so
Yeah.
I wanted to rewatch it again last night to kind of refresh my memory. Right away, I texted you while watching Totally Killer, and I was like, you know what I love about this film, Patrick, is that it doesn't get bogged down in the details. They're not
Yeah.
okay. And let me. This is not a spoiler. If you've seen the trailer for Totally Killer, you know it's a film that deals in time travel. So let me just. Okay, so this is not a spoiler. What I love about Totally Killer is they use time travel in the film. It's a part of the movie. We all understand that, but they don't spend 30 minutes explaining to you why there's time travel, how time travel works, and really getting bogged down the details about time travel. While it does play a major part in the film, of course it does, it's a film based around time travel, the explanations, the expository moments about time travel in that film are maybe 30 seconds or less each time they address it. And even when it doesn't make total sense, it doesn't matter because you're just having fun with it. It's not a film that just gets bogged down and mired in the details about, well, this happens and this happens. You got to do this. Here's the rules of time travel, blah, blah, blah. Over explaining time travel, which is so easy to do in a time travel film. Five Nights at Freddy's, the biggest problem I have with this film is that they really overcomplicate things for what should have been a pretty straightforward plot. A security guard gets a job to work at a creepy ass restaurant that is haunted by these animatronic puppets. And there is an underlying plot as to how these puppets were created, how they became alive, I guess, and the person behind it all, and the whole thing. And again, to be clear, so people aren't like, "Oh, you're giving away too much of the movie." This is all in the trailer. I mean, this is all in the trailer where they say, the animatronics are alive and it's the spirit of dead children, and these children went missing, and that's what closed down the restaurant. Blah. But this is nothing I'm giving away that isn't in the trailer. The plot there seems fairly straightforward, but when you get into the actual film, they really overcomplicate it, and they really dive into a lot of subplots and other storylines, particularly involving Mike, the main security guard, that really just serve no larger purpose. And I understand what they're trying to do is tie things together and give you kind of a twisty moment in the film, which again, I'm not ruining it for you now. We'll get into spoilers in a little bit. But when it gets there, it feels so unearned. It feels so like you were literally just like, as soon as it started, I knew where they were going. And they just kept badgering me with it. And there's like there are dream sequences in this movie, Patrick. We spend so much time in dream sequences that I was like, can I wake up, please? Because this is just not fun. Get me back to the restaurant with the creepy ass animatronic puppets. Get out of the dreams. Seriously, this was like half the movie is spent in dream sequences.
Yeah, I won't speak too much because I feel like I will start to get into spoilery stuff. So I will say this with regards to Five Nights at Freddy's and Totally Killer. And I'll use a phrase that I learned on another podcast called Writers Blockbusters, which I've shouted out here a few times. I think they're a great podcast. And if you like writing for film, you should listen to that podcast. They have a phrase that I love, and it applies so much to horror. The promise of the premise. The promise of the premise, just on its face, forget about like the history of Five Nights at Freddy's, forget about everything. I'm just a moviegoer. Clearly, I'm just a moviegoer who has no idea what I'm getting into. But the promise of the premise was a guy trapped in an old Chuck E. Cheese-like warehouse where these animatronic puppets may try to kill him. I didn't get that. I got a really convoluted story. A lot of it, a lot of things in there where I was like, I don't understand why we're bashing this, like the dream sequence thing over and over again. They often would I think set up stuff pretty well and then stop to explain the stuff that they set up really well. It was so odd. I'd be like, oh, they set up this little, portion with Mike or whatever. Mike's our main character, played by Josh Hutcherson. They'd set up a great idea, like just in the visuals, just in the story as it unfolded. Then they would take time to stop and explain all of that. It was really odd. And that felt that like reeked of like studio interference of like, people won't understand if you don't say it out loud to them. Like, that's bullshit. Especially with a property like this, where it's really popular, you tend to get a lot more hands in the pot because they know it's going to be a big movie. And this movie was massive. The promise of the premise for Totally Killer was time travel slasher. And that's exactly what you got from Totally Killer. Time travel slasher. And, and the trailer for it paints it as a comedy. Time travel slasher that's funny. Those are three big elements. So what do you do to make sure you deliver on the promise of those premises? You simplify. Don't worry about how time travel works. Don't even question why your high school friend has developed a time travel machine. And they explain it in like a little sentence, and it's enough. Because we need to get to the time traveling. We need to get to the slashing. We need to get to the funny. So you don't bog it down. And I was trying my damnedest to understand if like, is Five Nights at Freddy's supposed to be funny? I couldn't tell. I don't even know that it is supposed to be funny. But I knew it wasn't fun. Does that make sense, Damon?
Yeah. It felt very melodramatic. Like it turned into a very melodramatic movie for what is supposed to be kind of a goofy, I mean, I would say goofy, but like kind of a fun video game adaptation.
Right.
With kind of a goofy premise. I mean, again, the premise is kind of cool. Animatronic puppets, and we all probably went to a Chuck E. Cheese or Showbiz Pizza, I think was the other one when I was a kid. Everyone went to one at some point in their life. When you were at somebody's birthday party, you went to one of these places. And we all remember them. So having an idea that these animatronic puppets are alive and murderous is kind of a fun, different concept. I was like, okay, this is kind of cool. When I read up on the video game, I guess the original storyline for the video game changed at some point between like the first one and like the third one, where they added a lot more backstory and kind of twisted the narrative about where the animatronic puppets came from, who was in control of them, all these kind of things. That changed. And it almost felt like, so they basically used that secondary storyline that they did in the video game. I think it was like the third version of Five Nights at Freddy's, like the third game, is where they really kind of came up with the full backstory. At the beginning, it was just as simple as that, which was a security guard works in a haunted-ass restaurant that used to be a Chuck E. Cheese called Freddy Fazbear's, and the animatronic puppets are coming after him. That was the concept. It was just, that was the video game. And then they added all the backstory and everything later. And I get it. You know, video games have become a lot more complex. The storylines are a lot deeper now. They have a lot more narrative to them. And so I understand why you would probably change that. Because I think the first Five Nights at Freddy's game came out in 2014. And that is a lifetime ago for video games. Like a decade ago is like so far beyond where they're at now in video games. And when you think about like a really complex story like The Last of Us, which became a hit HBO series and will win Emmys. When they actually do the Emmy Awards, when the strikes are over and everything, that show will win Emmys.
Yeah.
That's an achievement in filmmaking for The Last of Us. And it was a very complex story that they had to adapt. Five Nights at Freddy's didn't start that way. It seemed like a pretty simple concept. And then they added layers to it to make it more complex, because when you're going to do like 8 sequels, you got to add something more than just murderous animatronic puppets in a restaurant, make it interesting to keep people coming back for part 2, part 3, part 4. It's they're trying to add story elements to it. So when they add the story elements in this film, as I said earlier, it just gets way too bogged down in the details, and it loses the interest of actually going up against these possessed animatronic puppets. Like, you're so entrenched in the melodrama and the family drama of this movie. Mike takes care of his little sister, which we see in the trailer. That's not, again, no spoiler. And we get bogged down so much in that storyline that you kind of lose track of like why the Freddy Fazbear's restaurant even really matters. And then, as I said, they try to twirl it all the way around at the end for a big plot twist.
Right.
That feels so unearned, and they beat you over the head with it so much throughout this entire movie that by the time the big revelation is made, not only would I imagine 95% of the audience had already figured it out, it wasn't even a relief. Like, it wasn't even like, oh, it's happening right now. The big plot twist happened. You're kind of like, thank God. Like, just get it out there and get it over with. Totally killer. If you can't tell by the early part of this podcast, Patrick, you and I, pretty much love this film. It's simplicity.
Yeah.
They don't here's the premise. In 1987, a masked killer who they dubbed the Sweet 16 Killer killed 3 girls at a high school in Washington, in a little town called Vernon. They were stabbed 16 times each and murdered, and then the killer just disappeared. And so it's kind of like part of this town's lore that there was this Sweet 16 Killer. And there was this group of 4 friends called the Mollies. They modeled themselves after Molly Ringwald, and kind of like the Heathers, which I loved. And the one surviving girl named Pam, 35 years later, she spent her entire life very much in a comedic sort of Laurie Strode way, was traumatized because all of her friends got murdered. She didn't get murdered. No one came after her. She didn't escape a killer, but all of her best friends got murdered. And so for the past 35 years, she's kind of been readying herself for the day when potentially this killer returns to come get her. Her daughter, played by Kiernan Shipka, of course, who people probably know from The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, is just like, Mom, it was 35 years ago. If the killer was going to come get you, he would have come got you already. Like, let it go. We got to move on with our lives. And so she wants to just go out and be a free spirited teenager, as we all would at 16, which, by the way, Karen Shipka is 23. She doesn't look 16. Let's just disconnect our believability. Trust me, nobody.
That's just Hollywood.
Let me also pray real quick. Let me get off subject. I love that Totally Killer just completely ignores the idea that we need actual teenagers, because Liana Liberato, who was in Scream 6, who's great, by the way, she's in this movie. She's like 28 playing a 16. She doesn't look sick. Now, she certainly doesn't look older. I'm not saying she looks like old. She doesn't look 16. But I that was 80s casting. They had Luke Perry playing a teenager in Beverly Hills 90210, and he was like 35. So you have to suspend your disbelief, but also have fun with it, because they're not overthinking it. They're like, yeah, here's good actors. They're kind of young. Sure, why not? Let's go with it. Karen Shipka is 23. She doesn't look old, but she certainly doesn't look 16. Again, neither here nor there. So Karen Shipka is she's kind of done with her mom's drama. She's like, you're just being over dramatic about this, Mom. I'm going to go out and live my life, and you need to just let it go. Well, what happens? Her mother gets attacked by the return of the Sweet 16 killer, and she dies. And Karen Shipka's character, Jamie, is so distraught about this that she's like, I didn't believe my mom. Now she's gone. She's guilt-ridden, and she wants to fix it. And then, as you mentioned, her friend has conveniently created a time machine. How, why a teenager can create a time machine? We don't know. We don't really care. Much less do we need to know. It's just there. And I love the simplicity of it. They're like, oh yeah, by the way, she created a time machine as a 16-year-old kid. Sure, why the fuck not? She travels back in time to 1987 and then tries to stop the murders from happening, so then by extension saving her mother in the future. She can stop the killer in 1987. By extension, in 2023, she will have saved her mom. That's the concept of the film. It never gets bogged down. You don't need to know anything else beyond that. And by the way, what I'm telling you is not a spoiler. That's in the trailer, and there's nothing else you need to know. Absolutely nothing else. And it never goes far beyond that. It's just fun, goofy. The time travel stuff, like the back in time, forward in time kind of stuff, is fun and kind of stupid. And there's a lot of timing jokes in terms of like things that are said in 1987 that you definitely would not say in 2023. That gets called out a lot, which are rather funny, because you and I were kids in the 80s. So we grew up in the 80s. We didn't grow up in the 80s. We were kids in the 80s. But even then, I was kind of like, yeah, I kind of remember that. And like, you definitely would not say or do some of the things you did in the 80s that you just can't get away with. We've evolved, I would hope, in 2023. We've evolved and wouldn't do some of those things. And so they call those out a lot. And it's really funny. And the characters are kind of goofy and very aloof and very unaware. Like, self-awareness in characters sometimes. These characters are totally not self-aware. They are 100% doofy 16-year-old kids, horny and trying to get drunk, and they're not really too concerned about the killer coming after them. And hilarity, but also horror ensues. There is a lot of, there are some brutal moments in Totally Killer.
Yeah.
Five Nights at Freddy's, while it is a PG-13 movie, and again, I've loosened my stance on PG-13 films when I started to realize how many good horror films were rated PG-13. The Ring is rated PG-13. You believe The Ring is rated PG-13?
No, for the closet scene alone, there's no business for The Ring to be PG-13.
But I've loosened my stance of like, I immediately kind of notched down the PG-13 horror films because I'm like, I know you can only go so hard. Five Nights at Freddy's doesn't even, like, this film felt like it could have been rated PG. Like, if it wasn't for the underlying themes of the children who were kidnapped back in the day and possessed, end up becoming possessed ghosts of these robots, which again is in the trailer, that's not a spoiler. If it wasn't for that, I honestly think this film could have been rated PG. Because they avoid any notion of like gore or horror, or
they have that one scene.
But even that isn't really.
Yeah, it's not really. They just have one little scene. No, you're right. Look, it's weird with Five Nights at Freddy's. I almost wonder if they were like, we have to make this accessible to children, is what it felt like. It's like, okay, there's thematically, it's a little crazy, and these animatronic puppets are kind of intense, so it ends up at a PG-13. But like, cut out the one scene that we're not going to talk about right now, which is not even really that big of a deal of a scene. My kids have seen worse, but it was almost like we need to make sure that like 5-year-olds can walk into this movie and watch it, and it'll be scary to them because these big robots look kind of scary and they attack people, but it's devoid of the potential for dread that is all over the premise. Like, the premise is great. Like, when I was a kid in Chuck E. Cheese, those fucking big animatronic things freaked me out. I was like, those are fucking creepy. I loved them, but I was creeped out by them. You could have made this movie a lot scarier if you wanted to. And on the flip side with Totally Killer, like, with all due respect for as effective a movie as was, it's kind of a B movie. It really felt like, oh, they made this in Canada for like, $250,000, and it kind of feels like it. Like, it's like kind of cheaply made, and there are cheap effects in it. Um, but what it does is it just keeps delivering on what you want. You want, like, the idea that the time travel happens and that a girl ends up hanging out with her mom in the 80s, and her mom turns out to be one of those 80s brats that is like totally terrible to her friends, and like that was a great reveal. The inappropriate humor that you talk about butting up against Gen Z is really cleverly done. I actually had some long discussions with some millennials about it. They were like, is this movie making fun of us for being overly sensitive? And I was like, yes it is. But it's also making fun of like people from the 80s who were just like woefully inappropriate. Like, they just were. Like, you and I both agree there's a lot we look back on, and especially in the early times of our podcast when we were still doing a lot of old classics back in the pandemic era. um a lot of those movies we were like, yeah, they shouldn't have done that one part, like that's not right anymore. But it's a movie that like delivers on that level, and then it delivers on the slasher level. Like, it's a slasher, and you set up with the history of this slasher. This, they talk about the history of the Sweet 16 killer. Then they have a great kill. Then they go back in time and there's more killing because we're trying to stop the killing as it's happening. It's like it delivers on all of its fronts, and that's why I can appreciate a movie that's maybe not as well made and well acted and well executed as Five Nights at Freddy's, but it just delivers on what it said it was going to deliver on. I don't know if Five Nights at Freddy's even delivered on what it meant to deliver on. It because and I don't know when you want to get into spoilers, maybe now, but like, it's just such a convoluted plot that I think if you intended to make it for 5-year-olds to be able to go and see, they'd be like, Mom, Dad, can we go? Like, I'm getting really bored. Like, especially my kids, like, for a long time, taking them to movies was kind of hit or miss. You had to take them to big shiny movies or they were just like kind of over it. Now they can sit and watch like a lot of stuff. But at the time they needed real input. And Five Nights at Freddy's doesn't give you a ton of input. It like dangles the carrot of the premise, like, oh, being at Freddy's and being attacked by animatronic robots is like I don't know, just under a third of the movie as a whole. And the rest of it is just like kind of like, I don't know, melancholy, like sad bastard plot. Is that fair assessment?
It is, and we're going to get into spoilers in 2 seconds. I do want to disagree with you on one thing here. I would disagree with you on the acting and the production of Totally Killer. While I do agree that it looks like,
oh, there's some bad CG in that in Totally Killer.
There
like
is
bad.
There is some bad, but there are some pretty cool. There are some cool practical effects in Totally Killer.
Mm-hmm.
But I would argue, in terms of production and in terms of acting in particular, was far beyond, in my opinion, what Five Nights at Freddy's was, minus one particular performance, which we'll get into in a second. We get into categories. I think Totally Killer nailed it, and they actually had a really good cast. You got Kiernan Shipka, who's
Oh
great.
yeah.
You had obviously you had Olivia Holt, who was great. She was in a show called Cruel Summer, which I watched, which was actually really really well done. Leanna Liberato, who I mentioned, was in Scream. It's actually a pretty well acted movie for that. But I would say in terms of production, I'm not talking about the CGI stuff. I'm talking about like the production value. They get it right. It's a small town in 2023, and it's a small town in 1987. They don't go beyond that. They don't try to go beyond that. So they don't try to escape their confinement of what they're trying to be.
Yeah,
In
no,
a
no,
small.
you're right. I'm just saying it's just sort of like CW quality. Like that doesn't, and acting is aside from like production.
Yeah.
That's not.
I mean,
I
to
don't
me,
combine the two things.
yeah, and you're not wrong. You're not wrong in that. But I would say that, like, in terms of production value, like they really nail it. I think part of the problem I have with Five Nights at Freddy's, beyond the idea that we just don't spend very much time at all at Freddy's, like we don't really spend that much time there, is everything is kind of, and I understand you're at a haunted restaurant, so you're not going to have like a super lit up thing or anything, but it's like very dark. Everything's in the shadow. And they do it so much that it just loses, like you just don't get any horror. And I understand, as you said, maybe they're trying to cater or pander to a younger audience, and they're not really concerned about the old farts like us talking about Five Nights at Freddy's. They're worried about the teenagers. But even the teenagers, from as you said, like, I was in a theater that was pretty packed. I went on opening night. I went and saw it in the theater, not Peacock. So I actually did see it in the theater. My theater was packed. Like, I had one seat between me on one side and one seat between me on the other side, and people all the way down the rows, which rarely happens. Unless it's like a Marvel movie opening, do I rarely have that much little room at an opening weekend. Even that, as you said, when you were talking about like the teen girls who were like, "Did you see it? Did you see it? Oh yeah, it was terrible." When we left the theater, I would say the average age was between maybe 20 and 25, so not super young, but not old either. Like, it was like, there were definitely teenagers there,
Yeah.
but there were also like there were definitely high schoolers in the crowd. But I would say the average age was maybe like 23. I heard so many people leaving the theater talking about it and being like, "Oh yeah, this," and like, "Oh, that was terrible. It was terrible." And I'm just like, okay, so I'm not wrong in thinking that this movie just failed to deliver on so much of what it was trying to do. So with that being said, Patrick, let's get into spoilers right now, because I feel like we have to address kind of the elephant in the room with Five Nights at Freddy's, and I assume we're on the same page here. Which I think, let me just start by saying, I mentioned the dream sequences. A big part of the plot of Five Nights at Freddy's is our lead character Mike. When he was a child, his younger brother got kidnapped when they were out at like a family picnic. And he's basically lived his entire life with regret, because he was supposed to watch his brother. His brother wandered off for 2 seconds. He got kidnapped. And as Mike ran to chase after him, he saw a car driving away with his brother in the back seat. And he could not remember the guy or the car, not enough detail to help police find his brother. And so for the last 20 years or 15 years or whatever the timeline is, he's lived with this torment that he couldn't save his brother. And so he dreams nightly. He's obsessed with the idea that everything we've ever seen or done in our entire lives is locked away in our brains somewhere. So he dreams every single night, locks himself in this repetitive dream, remembering his brother getting kidnapped in hopes that he can eventually remember the car or the guy who actually took his brother so they can find him. This is all these years later. And at the meantime, again, part of the weird storyline, so he ends up, his parents die, and he ends up getting custody of his little sister, who is like dramatically younger than him. Like, it looks like his daughter, but it's actually his sister. So his sister, sorry, I'm getting bogged down. So his sister wasn't around. His sister wasn't born yet when the one kid was kidnapped, but then she gets born after. So, but his parents were all distraught and never moved on from the kid. Yet they had another kid. It was a weird story. Like, why not just make it his daughter? Like, why not make that like the story? Like, that's his daughter. He doesn't want the same thing to happen to her that happened to his brother. I don't know. And then the big twist. The big twist in the movie is we find out that the guy who created Freddy Fazbear is a guy named William Afton, is the guy's name, was the one who kidnapped Of course, he kidnapped Williams. He kidnapped Mike's brother all those years earlier, but he didn't make it. He killed his little brother, and he also kidnapped a bunch of other children, and that's how Freddy Fazbear's became what it was. And the children are now possessing these animatronics, and it was all very not clear as far as like what they were going for, why it happened, how it happened, and it was way too convenient that we wrap up the story at the end, and be like, oh yeah, by the way, he's also the guy who kidnapped your brother 15 years earlier. It was just the weirdest, lack of a better word, Patrick, dumbest storyline that they got bogged down into. Like they just constantly kept drifting back into these dream sequences. We spent at least 30 minutes of this movie in dream sequences with Mike. At least 30 minutes in dream sequence of him relaying the same thing over and over and over again, of him seeing his brother getting taken, and then these ghost children that are suddenly in his dreams, that are the ghost children possessing the animatronics at Freddy Fazbear's. It was the most convoluted, overcomplicated plot that I can remember for what should have been a pretty straightforward story.
Now, help me out here because my research may have been limited. This dream thing, his younger brother being kidnapped, that's not part of Five Nights at Freddy's the video game.
It is not. It is not.
It is not.
At least not any of the stories I've read. No, it has nothing to do. The other parts of the plot are the same. You know, William Afton was that was the retcon story. After the first video game came out, they eventually retconned in the story. Right. That William Afton was the owner. He was also a kidnapper and a child murderer, and they really took it on a darker path. But no, Mike was never on the hunt for his younger brother who was kidnapped when he was a kid. That was injected, from my understanding, solely for this movie.
And Damon, I would even push back a little bit and say, if that was the plot of this movie, solely the plot of this movie, we might have a movie on our hands. The problem is you just talked about a third of the movie because there are other very big, heavy plots that get way in the way of this movie. Plot is a great sound effect for what's happening with the effects of this movie's story, because another huge part of this movie, like a massive part of this movie, is that Mike, who is a bit of a ne'er-do-well, like clearly like losing his brother Garrett when he was a kid, like kind of ruined his life. And they do a good job of kind of showing that. And again, then they stop and like explain it. It's like, no, we got it. You didn't need to explain it. So he's always, that's why he's taking on like security jobs, and he had a security job at the mall where he punched a guy out because he thought he was like kidnapping a kid. Because again, it triggered like his emotions from when he was young. They were doing a good job setting all of that up. Then they throw this wrench in that his aunt, who is, I believe, is she in here? Which one is she? The aunt is played by Mary Stuart Masterson, like kind of a big deal name. Aunt Jane is comically villainous. And she wants Abby, his sister. She wants sole custody of Abby. She wants to take him away from Mike, not because Mike is unfit to watch Abby, which I think there's an argument there. There's like enough of an argument to just go, you know what? I don't know if he's like the perfect person for her, but he does deeply love her. He's just a troubled guy. She doesn't want to take Abby away from Mike because of that. She wants to take Abby away for the money that she might get if she keeps her. And I'm going to tell you something. They don't like pay Mike $4,000 a month to watch Abby. They live in squalor. They're barely making it. And Aunt Jane is in nice clothing. She lives in a decent house. If she get an extra $400 a month and she's got to raise a kid, the motive makes zero sense, and it's big in the movie. It's a big part of the movie, to the point where she sicks her team of fucking, street thugs or whatever the fuck to go to Freddy's to sabotage his job, to get him fired, to make a better case to take full custody of Abby. What? Like, what? Like, really? I'm like, why are they spending so much time on this? And it doesn't make sense. It even doesn't make, like, the way she tries to get Mike in trouble doesn't even make sense. She waits till he leaves work to then sabotage the job. So he's not even on the job when it gets sabotaged. So why would it even necessarily go back to him? Because I guess he didn't lock the gate, which that's the only thing he did wrong. Like, it's such a weird divergence in this movie.
Do
And
you
it
want me
takes
to,
up a lot of hot air.
do you want me to explain why it happened and why it is also remarkably dumb that it happened?
Please.
So the aunt, it's Jane, right? Aunt Jane wants this, she wants this huge windfall of cash that apparently Mike doesn't get, as you said. They even they live
They
in a
live
very,
in
like,
they live in a flop house, Damon. They don't
yeah.
get any money.
So like, how much money does she think she's getting? And she also has to raise this kid. But again, let's just leave that alone. So her big brilliant move, and like it turns into like the movie Matilda or something for a second, where they're like making these villainous like sitting together plots in a restaurant, where she's actually plotting with Mike's babysitter, who is supposed to get inside information on what Mike's doing wrong with this
She's
kid.
working so hard to fuck Mike over.
It is literally like a 101 Dalmatians, like seriously, right? Like
Yeah.
on Disney plot. So her big idea they come up with is they need to get Mike fired from this job, so he becomes completely destitute. So he has to hand over Abby to the aunt so she can get an extra $500 a month or whatever.
Like her stakes make no sense,
So,
Damon.
so the babysitter's older brother, who was in with her this whole time to try to orchestrate this takeover on Mike. They wanted inside information on Mike, so he'd lose custody of Abby. The older brother suggests, why don't we go into Freddy Fazbear's, his new job, the last job he could get. He got fired from his old job. This is like the last job he can get. We go in there, we destroy the place, we wreck it, and then he gets fired. He has nothing left, and he has to hand over the kid. You pay us $1,000, we will go in there and trash the place. Now, by the way, pay us $1,000, which you're probably going to get back $500 a month for the kid, because clearly Mike ain't getting that much money. But again, let's not get lost in facts here, Patrick. So the people go in, it's the older brother, the babysitter, and then like two friends. They have all four of them go into the building to trash Freddy Fazbear's to make Mike look bad. And as you said, not even on the job at the time. How would he really get in trouble?
It's not even under his watch, so it doesn't make sense. Anyway.
So they go in. Here's where it all comes together. Here's why it happened, Patrick. And you're going to roll your eyes and slam your head on the desk. They only did it so these four people could go into Freddy Fazbear's and get killed. Because otherwise, the body count in this movie is 0. There's one guy at the very beginning, the security guard, who's watching it before Mike gets there, who gets murdered, that we see in the very opening sequence. And we don't really see him get killed. We just know he gets killed. The four people who go in there to break in and smash up Freddy Fazbear's to frame Mike for not doing his damn job, they are just there for body count. There is no other purpose for them being there in this story, in this plot, in this film, than to up the body count and give us a reason for these animatronic devilish bears, whatever the hell you want to call them, to kill people. That's it. They added this entire subplot to get to that scene.
Oh, I know. I'm aware, Damon, but you see how you and I both have put forth a lot of plot, and very little of it is Five Nights at Freddy's. Very little of what you and I have both just said in the spoiler section really pertains to Five Nights at Freddy's at all. Like very, very little. Very little. And it was just like, why are they trying so hard to shoehorn this plot in? If you want those bodies, first of all, stop making the aunt some comically weird villain. Like, it makes no sense. Like, just make the aunt be like, look, I know you're trying your hardest, but I think I'm at the end of my rope, and I think it's better for Abby to come live with me. It would have been way better to do that, and then just make the babysitter on her own and her little gang villainous and be like, hey, you know what if we go to that Freddy's place and see if there's any like stolen fucking, or like, you know, money in a safe or some shit. Like, just make that like fucking streamline the shit instead of bogging us down. It was so bogged down with story that I was just like, are we gonna get to anything like remotely horror related, like at all? like at all. And when they do get to it, then you have this thing, which is Five Nights at Freddy, is the whole idea that there's kids inside these, the kids' spirits and their physical bodies are exist inside these robots. I would have much rather just done a contained horror that shaved away all that other shit and just had like, Mike has this new job and it's his last chance, and his aunt is giving him a warning going, you need to make this work or Abby's going to come live with me because, like in like some other town far away. That would have been easy enough. So like, oh, I don't want Abby to go far away. And have him and Abby spend 5 nights at Freddy's and let the horror ensue there. Like just cut all this other shit out. Like none of it
Why,
helped.
why couldn't they have just had, like, if they wanted to have 4 people go in there as a body count, why couldn't they just have on Mike's first night of the job, he shoos these kids away as they're trying to break in and do graffiti and, create havoc in an abandoned building, as kids tend to do.
Right.
And
I
then
would have done it.
And they return the next day when he's not there, and then they just get killed. And he goes into work the next day and he notices a few things are smashed, the locks broken, whatever. And he's like, "What the hell happened?" But the guys are gone. They're all gone. All you had to do, you didn't need to overcomplicate the plot with, as you said, the cartoonish villainous aunt who's plotting for her extra $500 a month.
That she clearly doesn't need.
She clearly doesn't need, and clearly doesn't care about the kid. Yeah, it makes no sense whatsoever. And yeah, they way overcomplicate what they need to do. Also, can I? So I'm talking about they overcomplicate things. Yet here's one thing I wish they would have they would have explained better.
Complicated.
So the killer, William Afton, who we learned the big twist at the end is it's actually Matthew Lillard, who is actually the career counselor who gives Mike this job, and he's secretly William Afton, the creator of Freddy Fazbear's. And he also has a daughter who plays a police officer, which her entire...
Oh, I forgot about that plot.
Yeah, that's another one. His daughter works there. She's a police officer now. That's another one that gets bogged down in details that doesn't need to be there. So Matthew Lillard's character is this. So he's a kidnapper and a child murderer. We kind of learn towards the end because he killed Garrett, Mike's younger brother. Why? We never really figured. They never explained that part of it. But they mentioned that, so these animatronic puppets were meant to be robots, but they're also built to where you can actually have a human being in them controlling them, almost like a mechanical suit in a way. So the kids that he kidnapped ended up being put into these horrific suits that like clamp down and basically kill them when they go inside, yet somehow their spirits transfer into the robots and now possess them. Now, Patrick, I'm not trying to say like it doesn't make sense, but it doesn't make any fucking sense. Why? Like, so we're now talking about possession and ghosts, and does he want these kids alive? Does he want them dead? What is the point of the William Afton Kelly? Is he a kidnapper and he's doing really bad, terrible things to these children, or is he a killer? Is he Freddy Krueger? Like what?
And he has a relationship with those animatronic things too. Like they know him.
And his daughter too. Like he's uses her in a way to like. It makes no sense, Pat. It makes zero sense, and it all gets bogged down in the details when they just just make it to where these animatronic robots are turned evil by this guy, and the robots basically tempt the children in, like here's a lollipop in the van, and they kidnap the children and he kills the children. Like, I know that's dark, but like you don't need to overcomplicate it by saying the spirits of these dead children are possessing the robots. Like, why did that get injected? What in the hell does that have anything to do with anything else? And why is he a child murderer or is he a kidnapper? Like, what is his purpose?
You know what I think the mistake was? I think the mistake was including William Afton.
Yeah.
Like that was the mistake. Like I'll buy into the idea, as weird as it is, that these kids are possessing these suits, because then you could sort of play with something that's a little more like on the on the line of like an 80s fantasy film, like something like Labyrinth or Dark Crystal. The idea that these puppets are actually inhabited by children, and when they're kind of their instinct is to attack, but when they bump into Abby, they like her. They're like, oh, she's a kid like us, and so that it changes something. Like I could see a Clive Barker movie kind of playing like that, like just on that alone, just play with that. But including William Afton and his daughter, who is there to, I think, keep Mike there, but then has a change of heart. I They don't really make a lot of sense of why. Like, is she working for her dad to lure children in? So does that make her an accomplice to child murder? But then she's like, not. Uh Damon, this movie fucks itself like 10 ways to Sunday. It's just, I don't get it. I don't get why this movie is so fucking complicated, because I do think at its bones there was something, and they just said, let's build all this other shit around it. And I was like, I was like, why did they do any of that? I don't get it.
Well, they overcomplicated the villain's plot, and then they really overcomplicated Mike's plot by adding in his whole kidnapped brother thing, and then they overcomplicated that even more by adding in the aunt. Like they just kept throwing shit at this movie and being like, well, let's do this, and let's also do. The movie's 2 hours long.
Yeah.
I got home and I told my girlfriend, she was like, how was Five Nights at Freddy's? I was like, it was not good. I was like, to make it worse, it was I was like, this movie could have been done in 75 minutes and you would have had the same movie. Yep. It would have been trim. It would have been much better. And it would have actually had some real horror in there. Maybe.
Or maybe it would have been kind of a cool edgy fantasy movie that's sort of a gateway movie.
But by overcomplicating the plot and then adding in 50 different subplots that serve no real purpose, it just bogged the movie down. It's like you're literally watching this movie feeling like you're walking through quicksand. You're like, I can't escape. Like all this shit keeps dragging me down and it makes no sense. And then to the flip side, you talk about Totally Killer. Totally Killer, as we've raved about already, like that was why I text you right away. It's like they didn't overcomplicate the time travel. A 16-year-old girl created time travel, sure, why not? They didn't need to like overcomplicate like she's a genius or a 16-year-old girl created a time machine. Cool. Okay, we're back in time. We're in 1987. Then it's just that. Kiernan Shipka's character Jamie is just trying to stop her mother and her three other friends from being murdered so her mother survives into the future. That's it. That's the plot. All the subplots, the one major subplot to this entire thing, I guess there's two subplots in Totally Killer, not really subplots. One is Jamie trying to suss out the killer, who is actually the sweet, like she's trying to figure out.
That's the main plot.
Of who did it. She's trying to figure out, like, while protecting her mother and her friends, she's trying to figure out who it is that's doing it. And part two, which is a really funny subplot, which is and they use it really well. Later, early in the movie, her mother and father say that they knew each other in high school, but they didn't get together until after college because they knew if they got together in high school, it would have been a disaster. They were not ready to be in a relationship. It was a horrible idea. Back in time in 1987, Jamie accidentally puts it in her mother's head that she needs to be with Blake, who ends up being her father. And so she spends like a little bit of time in the movie, like once they realize, like she's like, you should be with him. She's like, ooh, I should be with him. She's like, no, don't do it yet. You're not ready. You're too horny. You're too horny. You'll cheat on each other. It'll never work out. Don't do it. And so she spends like little bits and pieces of the rest of the movie trying to keep her mother and father from boning as teenagers, as opposed to waiting until after college when they were actually mature enough to be in a relationship together. It's really funny because she's just like obsessed with like keeping them apart, almost again very like Back to the Future when Michael J. Fox is obsessed with getting his parents together. Same kind of thing here. She's just trying to keep them from boning early because she knows it's going to go bad. But it's hilarious. But it's a very minor subplot and it's a really funny subplot. But the entire
it pays off. It pays off really well because she fails at doing that. They end up hooking up. And what I love about it, and we're bouncing around a little bit, but what I love about that little subplot, because there are massive amounts of subplots in Five Nights at Freddy's that don't go anywhere. This subplot is I got to keep my parents from boning so I don't ruin my future. She fails at that. When she comes back to her future, she has an older brother and his name is Jamie. And her name is not Jamie anymore. Her name is Colette because her parents boned when they were too young. They had a kid and now she has like a 35-year-old brother named Jamie and she has a brand new name. I loved that comedic payoff. So like it was just so fucking good. It's like this little nugget of the story pays off this way in a really fun and simple way.
And also the plot line about who is the killer,
Oh yeah.
perfectly attuned with what this movie was. We find out that because they never solved the murder from the 80s. Like there were 3 murders and then the killer just disappeared. And so at one point, Jamie asks her mother and her group of friends, like, have you wronged anybody? Because she finds out that her mother and her group of friends, the Mollys, are bullies. They are like they are very much the Heathers of their school. They are the assholes. Like they're the most popular girls that everyone loves, but everyone also hates. And so she's like, who have you wronged? And so they start just listing off all the people they fucked with during high school. Oh, we did this, we did. And at one point they're like, oh, we did this to Fat Trish. And you can't call her Fat Trish, but like they keep bringing this up. Oh, like they did this to Trish. And then they finally realize that the killer was the guy who eventually grows up to become the principal of the high school, who was her boyfriend, and they just completely negate mentioning she had a boyfriend because they're so oblivious teenagers. You believe it because they're so oblivious to what they do. They don't really think of what they're doing as bullying or wrong because they're so out of touch with reality of what they're doing. Because you and I know we went to school with people kind of like that, where they don't see themselves as the villain. They don't see themselves as bullies, but that's absolutely what they are. And so they're so out of touch with torturing this poor girl. And basically, they heard a rumor that she had slept with the gym teacher. And so they took her to a party. They invited her to one of their super inclusive parties. They got her drunk, trying to get her to reveal this secret. She refuses. That never happened. She got all upset. She got in her car. She drove drunk, crashed, and died. And that was, and so they bring this up several times, like they think it's something to do with that. They find out that Trish has a brother. His name, by the way, is Damon in the movie. I did like that. There's a character named Damon in this movie, but he's actually searching for the killer as well. Like he's convinced like there's a killer out there as well. He actually ends up being a good guy, but he's kind of like the dark loner, he drives around in like a creepy no windows van and whatever, but he's not the bad guy. He's just kind of like a, weird dude, kind of like you and I were probably in high school. You've come to find out that the killer was actually Trisha's boyfriend who wanted revenge for what they did to her. But they know it's her boyfriend, but they just are so oblivious to that actually could be the guy that you're like, oh my God. Like you're like, at the end of the movie, you're kind of like, are you freaking kidding me? But in a good way, because that's exactly how teenagers are. They would, they don't even think what they did to Trish was that bad. Like they don't even think like getting her drunk and sending her home drunk driving and she dies. They don't really think that's that bad because they're so oblivious to the horrible things they're doing to people because that was teenagers in the 80s. And so that's the plot. And then we come to find out that there was they mentioned at one point, Kiernan Shipka's character mentions, it's like Scream. There could be 2 killers. And they're like, what's Scream? She's like, oh yeah, it's not out here yet. You haven't seen it. So they stopped the original killer from the 80s, but then a second Sweet 16 killer shows up and kills the last of the girls. The only ones left, of course, are Kiernan Shipka, her friend, and her mom. And so they've come to find out that the podcaster from 2023 who has spent his entire life basically trying to build a career around these murders in his hometown. He has like a tour and a podcast, and he's like trying to like make a career out of this one incident that happened in his high school years. He realized that no one really cares that much, especially that it's like 35 years later, 3 deaths, and there was never any follow-up, and the killer never reappeared. So 3 murders, while tragic, really aren't like a big serial killer kind of story. He needs to improve his plot if he's going to keep this podcast going. So he ends up being the one who kills Pam in the future and twists the plot that she was always being hunted by the killer, and he finally returned 35 years later to get his revenge on her as well. Turns out Pam, the mother, had nothing to do with Fat Trish. She wasn't there the night that her friends got her drunk and sent her off, and she died in a car crash. So you find out that the guy from the later years, Chris Duvisage, which is a really funny name, Chris ends up, when her friend repairs the time machine, because a 16-year-old could totally build and repair a time machine, he takes the time machine back in time because he wants to continue the plot. He wants to make his own story. He wants to create his own movie, very Scream-esque,
Yeah.
by continuing. And so he travels back to finish what happened, to finish what he started, finish this, so this plot continues so he can continue to become famous. And so they have to deal with a second killer. And while my explanation might sound long-winded, it's not. It's very simple. It's very easy to follow. It's very hilarious. There are actually some really cool, gory horror moments in this movie. And the ending, as you mentioned, pays off in such a huge way when Jamie goes back to the future and she finds out that there were consequences of what she did. Her parents did fuck. They had a brother, and they end up still having her. Her name is now Colette. And her friend that she made from years earlier is Amelia, the friend from the current timeline, and then her Lauren.
Yeah, I think yes, that's correct. Yes.
Her best friend who builds the time machine in 2023 is named Amelia. Her mom, Lauren, was the original designer of the time machine, but she never figured out how to get it right. She meets Lauren in 1987, and befriends her, and that's how she gets back to her current timeline. So when she travels back to 2023, Lauren finds her and says, I've kept track in this little notebook of all the things that are different from when you started in 1987 and the things that have changed in your new version of 2023. And it's almost like the classic 80s ending where you get the ending and then you get like the postscript of like, here's what happened to the kids in 16 Candles. Here's what happened to the Breakfast Club. Here's what happened, like the future. You know what I mean? Love those classic 80s. And so the little notebook is that, like where they're telling the story of what happened to this character, what happened to that character, what happened to the people who changed in the course of her, changing history. It's such a fun ending, and it wraps everything up perfectly. And it's, again, not overcomplicated. It's funny, it's horrific, and it's just a really perfect horror comedy.
Time travel can go really, really, really wrong in movies, and there can be major plot holes that can pop up. This ducks, dodges, and dives against those so well. First, by like kind of masking everything in comedy. So it's like if you really have trouble making something make sense, just make it funny, and that's what they do. It has a great slasher vibe to it because it is like it has the benefit of like, oh, we're going to go back to the 80s and literally set it in the era of the slashers and let the slashing ensue while we're also trying to find the killer. They deliver on all these fronts for something that could get messy, that something that could get overcomplicated, something that could get bogged down with plot. They go the opposite direction and go, let's make this fun. And just get to it and get to the things we need to get to and use time travel as a plot device rather than the plot itself. It is just the device for which to help the plot along. Fantastic. And I wish Five Nights at Freddy's had maybe either leaned on fun or leaned on horror. It leaned on neither. It leaned on like some weird custody battle that makes zero sense. Even in an 80s movie, it wouldn't have made sense. So never mind the lust for nostalgia in Five Nights at Freddy's. It just overcomplicated itself to the point that it was joyless, like a truly joyless thing. I'm really curious what week 2 for Five Nights at Freddy's is going to look like. If it's going to keep on that train, or there might be a lot of people who are curious because it's got such a big opening that they might go see it. So it might not have a dramatic drop off. But I want to say, and watch me be dead wrong, that the second weekend of Five Nights at Freddy's is going to be like abysmal in comparison because it's not fun for kids. It's not fun for adults. So who's it fun for?
Yeah, nobody. That's the answer. Nobody.
Yeah.
So yeah, I expect it to fall off a cliff myself because it doesn't seem like this movie's getting great reviews from anybody. Even the audience that's baked in is supposed to enjoy it. So, a lot of people went and saw it. Doesn't mean a lot of people enjoyed it. So we'll
Yeah,
see.
we could be
We'll
dead
see.
wrong. We'll find out next week.
Yeah, we'll find out next week. Well, with that being said, Patrick, let's get into categories because we're kind of splitting things up here because we are talking about two different movies. So we're going to pick our categories and we're going to pick our favorites from the movies. Because while there were a lot of inherent problems with Five Nights at Freddy's, it's not all bad. It's mostly bad, but it's not all bad. So let's kick things off as we do each and every week here on the show and talk about best performance. And Patrick, I'll open to you. Between Totally Killer and Five Nights at Freddy's, what was your best performance?
My best performance goes to Olivia Holt as Pam Miller in Totally Killer. She plays the young version of Jamie's mom. So when she goes back into 1987, she finds her mom and the Mollies, and it turns out her mom is a fucking jerk, an asshole, and a bully. And I loved that twist because her mom in the present was actually very nice and very and very much protective of Jamie and was a sort of a good woman. And you go, okay, well that makes sense. And so she'd probably be the good one of her group. No, she was the worst of her group. And it was such a cool way to subvert expectations. And I think Olivia Holt's performance as this young version of her mom, who does have to evolve as the movie goes along. Like, she starts out being a jerk. She starts out being very suspicious of Jamie for good reason. Cause it's like, what the fuck is this girl? To like having to realize that what Jamie is doing is trying to help, and it changes her in a very natural way. It's almost like for each thing that unfolds, Pam starts to twist a little bit more towards the side of good, like just an inch this way. It just changes how she makes decisions going forward. I think it really takes a good actor to make sure that stays in line, and I think Olivia Holt did it.
She's really good. She's really, really solid in this movie. She's oblivious in a lot of ways when you first meet her. She's oblivious that she's a bully. She's oblivious that she's kind of like the mean girl in her high school. And through her friends dying and through the conversation she has with her new friend, Jamie LaFleur from Prince Edward Island, Canada, which is a hilarious little twist in this movie. That when she shows up in 1987, Kiernan Shipka's character goes to school to find her mom, and she's like, my name's Jamie LaFleur. I'm a exchange student from Canada. And the receptionist is just like, sure, here's your class schedule. And she's like, this was really easy. And like, yeah, that was kind of how it was. No one really checked shit back then. So she's Jamie LaFleur, and she has to help and protect her mom, and her mom evolves during the movie. And Olivia Holt is really, really good in the role because she is, oh boy, she is like the total mean. She is Heather from Heather. She is like the main Heather, really, really mean, really, really mean spirited, just a cruel girl. Like, she's just like they open the scene when she goes back in time and finds her mom. They're playing dodgeball. And her mom pegs her in the head with a dodgeball. And she's like, get off the floor. And she just bashes her in the head with another ball. She's like, get off the floor, bitch. And you're like, oh my God, your mom is horrible. It's great. Olivia Holt's performance, I agree, was top notch. Absolutely. So for me, my best performance, again, I'm going with Totally Killer, and I'm going to go with Kiernan Shipka in the lead role as Jamie. She played the hero, the heroine, but also like the comedic relief in a lot of ways so perfectly because she has a lot of the action beats. She has the knowledge of what's actually happening throughout this movie, but she still manages to be hilarious in so many ways. Even the first interaction she has with her mother when her mom is just like really being a total, let's say, C word for lack of a better word. And Jamie goes, Jesus, mamacita.
Mamacita. Ay, mamacita.
It's really funny. And then there's just so many moments where she's just like, that's really problematic. You need to not do that. It's like,
yeah,
it's just really funny. Like, she calls out the inappropriate things that are being said in the 80s. And she just plays it really well. Like, she gets the emotional beats because, like, when her mother dies in 2023, she's like kind of takes the blame for herself a little bit because right before that, she's telling her mom, like, let it go. It's been 35 years. No one's coming for you. And then that night, someone comes for her.
Yeah.
So she plays that role. So there are some weirdly dramatic beats in a largely comedic movie, but she plays the action beats great too. Like she plays like she has to get some physical. She has to get physical in this movie with like some self defense stuff. And she plays the heroine very very strong. She's a great lead. Like you need a strong lead, and Kiernan Shipka does it very well.
Yeah, I fully agree. Just it's a very comedic role, and she does play like it's sort of like it's clearly like Gen Xers writing what they think millennials and Gen Zers are like, which can go south. Like it can be like yeah, old farts writing what they think kids are like can be like it can show on on the screen as like looking dated, but she carries it well. Like she finds that balance so she doesn't look like a parody of Gen Zers. She looks more authentic than you would normally guess for something like that.
Yeah, she pulls it off really well, and it's really funny. Like, there's a great scene where she's talking about weed in the '80s, and she's like, "This is just dirt. Like, I could give you a gummy this big that would be like twice as much power as this weed." It's just again the real funny little intricacies of like 2023 to 1987, and really funny. And again, they don't bog it down in details, but it's funny the way she pulls everything off.
Absolutely.
Let's talk now about favorite character, best character between these two movies. Patrick, who is your best character between Five Nights at Freddy's and Totally Killer?
My best character was actually Mike from Five Nights at Freddy's. Um, because I think like weirdly, the one thing that movie did really well was put together Mike's scenario. And even with the overly plotted idea of the dreams and all that stuff, like his story made sense to me. His story, everything else around his story sucked, but I knew what was going on with Mike, and I liked the way Mike was drawn, and I liked the way he acted. That was the actor was what's his name? I had it here.
Josh.
Josh Hutcherson. Josh Hutcherson did a good job of playing sort of this melancholic, down on his luck guy, and you knew why. So I give credit to like that element of Five Nights at Freddy because I understood what that character was going through, and he was conveying it well on screen.
Yeah, I mean, again, they overcomplicated his story that didn't need to be overcomplicated, but for what he did for his performance and what he did as a character was great. And again, they just didn't need to. The whole subplot with his brother being kidnapped and him being haunted in his dreams for the last 20 years or whatever it was, or 15 years, or whatever the timeline is, that just, again, just too much. There was just too much going on there. Like, just keep it simple. When he was at work and the creepy shit started happening, he reacted appropriately. Yeah, so he was a good character with that. Also, let me backtrack real quick. I do want to say I mentioned my best performance was Kiernan Ship because she is my best performance. I also do want to give credit where credit's due, even though his character didn't make a whole lot of sense, and I was kind of like, man, he got ruined in this movie. I really did like Matthew Lillard's performance. I love Matthew Lillard in general, of course, great actor from Scream. He did a great job for what he had to work with in Five Nights at Freddy's. He just didn't have a lot of good material to work with. But
No.
his performance was great. I really liked his performance. I wanted to shout that out because it sounds like everything I'm saying about Five Nights at Freddy's is negative, and mostly it is. But I did like seeing Matthew Lillard. My disappointment, of course, is they kind of wasted Matthew Lillard because, like, you kind of find out at the end that he is William Afton. He is the creator of Freddy Fazbear's. He is this child kidnapper, killer, whatever the hell we're actually saying he is. And he's just kind of like a wasted character in the end. But again, that's just my opinion. For me, my favorite character in these movies, between these two movies, was actually Troy Lee Johnson as teen Lauren Creston in the 1987 version. So Lauren was the best friend from 1987, the girl who grew up to have a daughter who ends up being Jamie's friend in 2023. So she travels back in time and she seeks out Lauren, who is the original girl who designed the time machine. And once again, don't get bogged down in details. She pulls Lauren out of class because kids could do that in the 80s.
Yeah.
She pulls her out of class. She's like, have you seen Back to the Future? She's like, of course I have. She's like, okay, I'm Marty McFly. Here's what's happening. And Lauren's just like, all right, cool. Let's get you back to now. Let's get you back to 2023. I was like, this is so awesome. They didn't complicate it. They didn't spend 25 minutes trying to convince Lauren that Jamie was from the future. She's just like, oh, okay, sure. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah, Lauren already had some designs for a time machine. She just had to figure it out.
Lauren becomes the perfect best friend. Like she becomes like the mechanical piece to get Jamie back to where she's going while also trying to help Jamie solve the crime from the past. She's like the perfect best friend in this movie. She's the best friend you want, the best friend you need. She's a problem solver, she's smart, she's analytical, and she gets it. And I just loved that character. She was self-aware, she was smart. I just loved that character. And even Amelia, the daughter in the future, was very much the same way. I could have easily said Amelia because Amelia is largely the same character in the future, being the best friend who's trying to fix the time machine to get Jamie back to 2023. So yeah, I just loved that character of Lauren. I thought she was really smart, really aware, and I just love the simplicity of it. Like she's a 16-year-old girl designing a time machine in 1987, because why the fuck not? We don't need to overcomplicate this. Let's just go with it. And then I just love when she shows up, she's like, I'm Marty McFly from Back to the Future. Lauren's just like, sure, okay, let's go with this. It's just great. Also, I want to throw out one other thing I mentioned. I mentioned all the like self-aware lines, the inappropriate lines. There's one line that Kiernan Shipka's character drops that I should have pulled for best line, but it just made me laugh. It's a real throwaway moment. They were talking about security at one point. I can't remember what they were trying to do. It was the cops. Something was going on with the cops. And Kiernan Shipka goes, she goes, boy, getting on a plane back to them must have been a trip because like there's just no security. Like they make a very self-aware comment of where we are now in 2023 after sadly what happened with 9/11, like how much security there is like getting on a plane. She's like in 1987, she's like, getting on a plane back here must have been a trip.
Yeah, you could just walk up to the plane itself to greet people and shit like that. And
like they just did not get like there's just so much of that. Like when she walks into the school and she talks to the receptionist, she's like, my name is Jamie LaFleur. I'm from Prince Edward Island in Canada. I'm an exchange student. She's like, here's your schedule. She's like, so you don't need any records or like ID? She just looks at her, gives her like the knowing look, like, what the fuck do you expect?
Like, take your schedule and get the fuck out of my face.
It's so great, but it's so perfect because that's what it was like.
Yeah, it totally was. And Lauren was a cool character. She was sort of like mellow Doc Brown. Like they had a Doc Brown character, but it wasn't like a goofy caricature. She was just like, yeah, okay, I've had an idea for a time machine for a while, and I do believe this can take place. So yeah, I'll buy that. You're my Marty McFly. Let's do this.
Yeah, I love it. I love the simplicity of it. We don't need to over-explain it. Let's just go with it.
Yeah.
Let's get into best kill because there are quite a few kills, mostly in Totally Killer, but there are some in Five Nights at Freddy's. So Patrick, what was your best kill between these two films in our special double feature?
I gotta tell you, this is my only umbrage with Totally Killer, aside from like some bad CG. They put the best kill right up front, and that is when they kill Jamie's mom. So in the present, Jamie's mom has gone 35 years, in total fear that this killer's coming for her. So she's well prepared, like very well prepared, very Laurie Strode in Halloween 2018. She's ready for that killer when that killer shows up. And the killer shows up and they have this like knockdown, drag out fight that is incredible, like a really incredible action sequence. And then he brutally stabs her, like, I don't know, 10, 13 times. I don't think he gets to 16, but he stabs the shit out of her. It's super intense. It's the best kill amongst the two of these movies, in my opinion. The only problem was they did it right up front. Like, all the other slashing's great in Totally Killer, don't get me wrong. But I was like, wow, it never got crazier than this moment.
I swear to God, Patrick, I didn't intend on doing this. I swear to God, I didn't intend on doing this. Pam fighting the Sweet 16 killer in 2023 was exactly what Laurie versus Michael Myers should have been in Halloween Ends. I have to take a dig at that movie because Halloween Ends ruins it because we spend the entire movie waiting for the final showdown between Laurie and Michael Myers, and when it happens, it's so anticlimactic. It is just so like, this is what we waited for? This is 40 plus years of waiting for this moment, and this is what we get? totally killer. Like Pam is a badass. Like she's got guns hidden around the house. She's got tasers. Like she's been preparing for the day that this guy comes back for her. When he finally shows up, she's ready, man. She is ready, and it's a knockdown, drag out fight. Sadly, of course, Pam ends up getting in the end because that's the big plot twist that she dies. So yeah, that's the exciting event, as you call it, that kind of propels us forward in the story. But the fight through the house is epic. It's a great fight. It is everything
Yeah.
you want in a slasher versus the final girl, but this final girl doesn't survive. It's a great sequence.
Really, really good.
So my best kill is going to be from Five Nights at Freddy's. It's the one kill, and I have a beef with it, but it's also the best kill. So when our four thugs, for lack of a better word, go in to destroy Freddy Fazbear's to frame Mike for not doing his job, even though he actually wasn't on the job. Again, not not dwelling in that too much here. You weren't there at work, but somehow it's your fault. These four people, again, they're just there for body count. That's all they're there for. Why it had to be that overly complicated plot makes no sense. But these four people go into Freddy Fazbear's to destroy the place. And it was actually three at the beginning. It's the brother of the babysitter and two of his thuggish friends. And they all get wiped out. Like the animatronic bears come after them, and it's just like a slaughterhouse in there. And so the babysitter outside finally decides to go in and find her brother because she's like, what happened? What's going on in here? Like, where are you guys at? She gets inside and she finally gets attacked. And her death is by far the best moment of this entire movie, which is when one of the animatronics, is it Freddy? I can't remember. Is it Freddy? I think it is.
I want to say it was. I thought it was the wolf one, but I could be
Maybe
wrong.
it's the wolf one. I can't remember. One of them literally grabs her. She's looking in the mouth. She sees one of the spirits, little kids, running towards this thing, and she thinks the kid's inside the bear, which we find out actually there is a kid in there. We assume it's a rotted corpse at this point, which, by the way, wouldn't these things smell really bad if there's kids like hidden in there? Like all these. Again, sorry.
Don't look for logic. Mistake.
Sorry. So she looks for the kid and she climbs up on a little step ladder. Like she thinks the kid's hiding inside this bear or inside this wolf, whatever it is. And the thing jumps up and leaps up and grabs her and bites her in half. And her bottom falls off, almost like Jurassic Park in a way. Yeah. That to me was the coolest kill. Now, here's my beef with it. It's shrouded in shadow, and so you don't really see any blood. And again, it's a PG-13 movie, so I don't know how extreme they can go. Although, I will say, you can push the boundaries pretty far in a PG-13 movie these days. But neither here nor there. The fact that the thing picked her up and literally bit her in half, and you see her bottom half of her torso just flop down to the ground dead. Really cool kill. I just wish we had seen more like that.
If this movie had been littered with kills like that, because even though it was like that, it skirted the line, because I think you see most of it in the shadow. You see the shadow chop her in half and all that. I was like, if you'd have done this kind of throughout the movie, you might have had a passable movie. It was still bogged down with too much fucking story, too much weird diversions and shit. But like that was like a taste of what this movie could have been, but then it ended up not being.
Yeah, I mean the animatronic things killed those four people and the security guard at the beginning, and that's pretty much it. Like they don't really do anything else. Like
they had this great mask too that like you put the mask over the person to kill them. It was almost like a jigsaw style trap. It had these like spinning blades and stuff, and it was going to close in on them and obviously like destroy their face. You see a little bit of aftermath of one person that got the razor mask to their face, but like just that stuff was not utilized, and it seems like it couldn't even have been utilized because of the PG-13 rating.
Yeah, but that kill was pretty cool. Again, I wish it had been more graphic, but for what it was, pretty cool. Like, again, very Jurassic Park moment. I enjoyed that. Patrick, do you want to intro the next category of best use of 80s tropes? Because I like this category, but you came up with it, so I'll allow you to intro it.
Yeah, I came up with which of these movies used 80s tropes better. Now, it might seem like Totally Killer has an unfair advantage because it takes place in the 80s, a large portion of it. But Five Nights at Freddy's, it does play into a very specific time period. I know Chuck E. Cheese is still around, and I know the animatronics, I think, have lost their like luster, but like it very much is like it takes nods towards the whole Freddy Fazbear place is a big nod towards the 80s. And so I was curious which you thought did a better job of actually homaging the 80s.
Well, I mean, listen, I will say, as a kid who grew up, in that time period, I remember what Chuck E. Cheese looked like and things like that. Which, by the way, did anyone actually like Chuck E. Cheese food?
I don't remember eating it.
Did anyone ever actually like the food at Chuck E. Cheese? Like, was it actually a place where you'd go to want to eat there as a restaurant, or was it just there for the games and shit? Because I don't remember ever going there and be like, this piece is delicious.
Yeah, I don't think they have delicious.
Just throwing that out. Just throwing that out there.
No.
I will say the concept of Freddy Fazbear's is pretty authentic to what it was in that time period of the 80s, like those animatronic puppet kid show kind of things. But as a connoisseur of the nostalgic 80s, Totally Killer gets it right on a lot of levels. The unbelievable lack of self-awareness, the outfits, the scenery, the production value, everything looks and feels very 80s. And also, it's not an over amplified version of the 80s, which is what I liked about Totally Killer, because we've seen some movies that do time travel and everything is exaggerated. They really exaggerate that you're in the 90s, you're in the 80s, or whatever time period you're in. You know what I mean? Like, every time travel movie does it to some extent. They over exaggerate the time period. So you really feel like you're in the 80s. You really feel like you're in the 70s or wherever you're supposed to be. They didn't do that. They did it just enough. Again, there's a couple of funny scenes. One's in the trailer where the woman's like, the 80s are almost over and I haven't even tried Coke. And it's kind of funny, yeah, that's what you did in the 80s. But yeah, like they use it. They use the 80s as a tool that works really well, but they don't beat you over the head with it. They don't over exemplify what you're doing in the 80s. It's just a movie that takes place in the 80s. So I think Totally Killer gets it totally right. Although, again, I will give credit. Freddy Fazbear's as an establishment feels authentic. My biggest problem with the movie, beyond all the plot and crap we talked about, is we don't spend enough time there. We really don't spend enough time inside Freddy Fazbear's with these animatronic, psychotic, possessed puppets. I want more puppets, Patrick. I want more of it.
Yeah, I could use a little more of that. I definitely could. I'm going to give credit to Five Nights at Freddy's for something else that is very 80s that I think they unintentionally did, which is they made a movie that's really depressing for kids. The reality that like the kid that Mike and his sister Abby are in is depressing, and that's a very 80s thing, actually. Like when you look at like the reality of the Goonies is that these kids are all going to lose their homes. They're all going to get bulldozed, and they're all going to have to move somewhere else. That's the reality of that. The reality of E.T. is that little Elliot and his brother are in a broken home, like and they're almost like to their own devices. 80s movies are like that. And Five Nights at Freddy's has that in it. I have to give it credit for that. I don't know if they meant to do that. It's so hard to tell because of all the shit they try and throw at us. I can't tell if that element is truly there, but it is indeed kind of like a movie for a new era. And I have to give that, I have to acknowledge that it is a movie for a different generation. But so many so many things from millennial time and Gen Z time sort of make it seem like, hey, like we're kind of all right. Everything's all right. And this harkens back to the 80s of like, it's not all right. Our lives fucking suck. Like our lives are shitty. And so I give Five Nights at Freddy credit for that. But ultimately, Totally Killer uses the tropes of the 80s so much more effectively because it's built into the plot. The plot needs the 80s and it does it really well. I especially appreciated, I think, the culture clash between this Gen Zer and these 80s people where one scene I absolutely loved. A guy walks up and she's questioning people, and the guy walks up and he's got a FBI shirt on, Federal Bikini Inspector. And
Booby
she's like,
federal booby inspector.
"Oh, it was a booby inspector."
Booby
It
inspector.
was booby inspector. Okay, great. So yeah, so he has that shirt, and she goes like, that is so inappropriate, and walks away, and his girlfriend goes, "I like that shirt." And
Yeah.
I go, that's fucking 80s. Like even the women even at the time didn't find something like that offensive. It was just it was those were really nice touches, and that was actually one of my more favorite parts of the movie was the culture clash of Gen Zers and Gen Xers from the 80s.
Oh, there was another great line too when Lauren is trying to tell Jamie that her time is running out. Like, you need to be here at this time to get back to the future, or you're going to be stuck here forever. She says, it's a very throwaway line, but it works so well. She's like, if not, you better learn Reaganomics because you're going to be stuck here for a good long time. Like, Reaganomics was a big thing in the 80s when Ronald Reagan was president, and she just mentions it in a very throwaway line. But it's really funny when she says it. She's like, because if not, you better learn Reaganomics because you're going to be growing up with me here in the 80s.
Yeah. Yeah, that turned out great.
Yeah, she's like, I think she says something like, "You better learn Reaganomics, and we got a trig test on Tuesday because you're going to be here for a while." It's a great line, great throwaway line. But again, we keep comparing these two movies. And the reason why this is a great double feature is because Five Nights at Freddy's has the premise, and I know I've said this a lot recently with some movies that I haven't totally loved. Premise is better than the execution. The premise of Five Nights at Freddy's wasn't bad. The execution was god awful. Totally killer. The premise is great, and the execution is almost flawless. Like, they just stick to what works, and they don't overcomplicate it. And I will bring up this one. It's just simplicity works for the right movies. We talk about it all the time with plot. I love a good plot, I love a good story, but I also don't need you to bog it down in so many details that I lose track of what was the point of the movie. I knew what the point of Totally Killer was. Never lost track of it, and even with time travel, I didn't lose track of that.
Right.
Five Nights at Freddy's, I'm like you, by the end I was like, what the hell was going on? Like, what was the point of all this? Like, he gets to keep his sister. It was just, again, it was very convoluted.
It's very, very convoluted.
Let's talk now about favorite gateway horror. Now, this is more specific to Five Nights at Freddy's because Five Nights at Freddy's, we talked about earlier about us being old farts. We didn't play the video game. We don't know the video game. We're not familiar with the video game. We know what it is, and I knew what it is going in, as did you. Certainly didn't understand the total popularity, didn't expect the biggest opening in history, but again, it is what it is. So this is Five Nights at Freddy's. We realized at some point during this movie, this is not geared towards an older audience. This is definitely geared towards a teen audience, which is fine, by the way. Again, and by the way, there's plenty of movies. We reviewed Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which was totally geared towards teenagers, and you and I, by and large, really liked that movie.
Yeah, I thought it was good.
Just to be clear, I'm not like against the movies that are skewed towards a younger audience. They can still be good if done right. But Patrick, let's talk about gateway horror, because you and I grew up in an era where we watched things were absolutely inappropriate for our age group, yet we watched them and became horror fanatics that we are today. But in a real world, there's probably movies that are better suited for a younger audience that necessarily weren't made for adults, but they serve as a great gateway to make future horror fans. Now, before you give your answer, I hope I'm not spoiling your answer. I'm sure I probably am, so I'm sorry. I apologize. The automatic answer that I know you and I will default to every single time with a category like this is a film that you and I love, and that is The Monster Squad. Now, the reason I'm saying that now is because I'm not picking The Monster Squad.
And I'm not either.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
So I thought one of us would pick it, and I was only spoiling it for this reason because that's the one I would default to that every single time.
Yeah.
It's brilliant. It's amazing. It holds up. It's great. I just watched it again recently. It was on cable. I watched it. I still love it. That is 100% a perfect gateway horror film. It came out in 1987. It's brilliant. I love The Monster Squad. Yeah. It still holds up today. And I know you've had your kids watch it.
They love it. My 6-year-old has a Monster Squad T-shirt. It's his favorite T-shirt, and he wears it
So
to school all the time. Fucking
let's
loves
just
that movie.
yeah, let's just put that in like the pantheon of like you can't touch this movie. Okay, so I'm actually
Yeah.
really happy neither one of us did that. So Patrick, what is the best gateway horror film that you can come up with that would be a great way for a film that's maybe not totally made for adults, or maybe that skews a little bit younger, that will help a younger audience, maybe teenagers, stick around and get into horror?
Well, I realized when I made this category, because I was like, oh, Five Nights at Freddy is 100% gateway horror. It 100% is. There's just enough intensity in it that a child, like a kid, a 10-year-old kid who's like, I want to go to Five Nights at Freddy's. Like, that's crazy for a 10-year-old kid. Now, my kids happen to be, the sons of a horror fanatic. So I showed them things like The Lost Boys and shit like that. But it started to make me realize that the 1980s actually had a lot of gateway horror. It had horror that wasn't like explicitly horror. It was just creepy and scary and a little bit weird. Lost Boys is definitely on that list, but I didn't pick Lost Boys either. I picked Beetlejuice. Beetlejuice is a whimsical movie. It's got that great little flittering Danny Elfman score behind it. The characters are cartoonishly delightful. If you want to have your first crush, Delia, is it Delia? It's Delia, right?
Delia Dietz, yes.
Yeah, Delia Dietz, great is a great first crush. And by the way, her stepmom in the movie ain't bad either. Catherine O'Hara is like super fucking great in that movie as well. Like it's funny and fun, and then it gets just scary enough. Like my kids watched it and they were like a little freaked out by some of the scenes, like where Gina Davis like rolls her eyeballs out and pops them out and then like stretches her face, and like they were like, whoa, that's kind of fucking crazy. But they could handle it because it was kind of drenched in that cartoonish Tim Burton world. So to me, I was like, that's a great gateway horror film.
Yeah, Beetlejuice works. Beetlejuice absolutely works. I'll be honest, I am not a Tim Burton fan, but that is one Tim Burton movie that I do enjoy. I do enjoy Beetlejuice. I am not a Tim Burton guy, though, unfortunately. You'll probably not get me to rave about much beyond Beetlejuice, but I do like Beetlejuice. That is
no Edward Scissorhands for you?
No, I do not need to see. Do not.
Batman 89?
Batman 89, I have a nostalgic love for.
It's good. We
love
watched it. It's still good.
I love it. I love it because that was the superhero movie of our era. Like
Pee-wee's Big Adventure?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Okay. We're getting onto a Tim Burton tangent.
Yeah.
But I would pick Beetlejuice, yeah, as a good gateway horror.
Beetlejuice is great. That's a really good one, and I would say that's outside of the problematic version of Jeffrey Jones, if we eliminate him from that movie. Just think about everyone else in the movie. It's great. Winona Ryder's great in that movie. Michael Keaton is brilliant. They're doing a sequel. I don't know how I feel about that, but
we'll see.
We'll see. But yeah, I agree. That's a great gateway horror. My pick, I went a little bit more modern. I went with a movie that's definitely not necessarily made for children, but I know a lot of children have seen it and love it, and it freaked them out, and it made them horror fans. And that is M. Night Shyamalan's Signs.
Nice. That's a good one.
Signs is just scary enough. It's an alien invasion movie that also has children in the plot, so children can relate, because that to me is always a key. If you want your kids to get into a movie, there needs to be a kiddish element, whether it's a teenager, high school, there needs to be a kiddish element involved to get them drawn in, because as we always talk about, representation matters, and if you can see yourself in the characters a little bit more, you're going to be drawn to them a little bit more. I think that's probably why you and I love the Lost Boys and the Monster Squad, because we can see ourselves in those characters a little bit.
Totally.
Signs has that. Signs has the two little kids. Joaquin Phoenix is kind of like the goofish brother, uncle kind of character. And then, of course, Mel Gibson, another problematic person, but that's neither here nor there. Mel Gibson is the former pastor who has now lost his faith. And he's a father to his kids, and then there's this alien invasion that happens. And the alien invasion is pretty terrifying at moments. There are some pretty scary moments in this movie, but it's not overtly horror, meaning there's not a lot of gore. There's not a lot of people's heads getting chopped off, anything crazy like that. The scares are just enough to where you freak out a little bit. Because when I saw this movie, I was an adult when I saw this movie. It still freaked me out a little bit.
Yeah.
But the story is not overcomplicated. You understand what's happening. You know why it's happening. You're not going to get lost. You're not going to be in a movie where the kids are going to be like, what's happening? It all makes sense. The payoff is great. The plot twist at the end is a little weird, but it still works. And it all comes around. Everything that happens in this movie serves a purpose. Every little story thread, the plot device with the little girl who's obsessed with drinking water and everything's contaminated, so she leaves water spread throughout the whole house. Then by the end of the movie, it pays off. Merrill, the brother, played by Joaquin Phoenix, plays baseball. He was kind of a burnout, didn't really make it. You find out why and his purpose. Oh, everything serves. Like, this is a movie that is built around the concept, which I don't truly believe in, but for this movie, everything happens for a reason.
Yeah.
And this movie, it pays off in spades. It's just a fun, scary alien invasion movie that doesn't go too far.
You're 100% right. It can be very intense at times, actually. And it's one of those things too, where it's like, you know, the jury's still out on whether like aliens exist or not. You know, I'm not going down that rabbit hole, but it's like, it's the one thing I could tell my kids, there's no such thing as fucking ghosts. I've never seen a ghost in my, like, I've never known anyone to convincingly show me a ghost. So they're not real. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Dracula's not real. Well, what about aliens, Dad? Well, I've definitely never seen one, but I can't tell you that they're not real. Like, I can't tell you that one day they won't come down from the sky and go, hey, we've come from a long way away and you're all fucked, which is kind of the plot of Signs. And so like, there's that creepy factor to it too. And there's a couple of intense things, like, you know, the plot with the mom dying and saying swing away, like that's intense. Like she died in like a pretty violent car accident. Like, there's enough in there to be like kind of dangerous for a kid to watch it and just be like, wow, this is like heavy shit, but it's still very accessible. It was almost like M. Night Shyamalan knew that he couldn't make something as intense as The Sixth Sense, but he wanted to make like his own Close Encounters of the Third Kind for kids that had a horror twist to it. And it's very much that. That's a great pick for a gateway horror, because I do know some millennial adults who are like, yeah, Signs was the first movie that ever fucked me up.
And I would say one other thing I want to mention about this movie, even though I would say it's absolutely appropriate for kids, like you could put a 10, 12-year-old kid in there and it wouldn't freak them out to the point where you're like scarring them for life. I was gonna joke and say my gateway horror film is Terrifier 2. No. It's still, Signs to this day has one of the top 10 jump scares of all time.
So good.
And when they have Joaquin Phoenix in the closets and he's watching video from a birthday party in Brazil, and you hear all these little kids gathering around a window, and you see an alien walk by for a split second, it is one of the freakiest, scariest moments in film. I still to this day jump when that scene comes on.
I love that. It just taps so much into like the cryptozoology in me, and like and that idea of just like we captured it on foot, like on video. We captured it on video, and like it felt very real and grounded in that moment. And then the screaming of the children, and you're just like, this feels very real. Like, it just, something about that moment felt so real, and it freaked the shit out of me. And I was an adult too when I saw it. I was just like, no, it's very good and effective, but nothing in there is like overtly violent. Nothing in there is overtly like gory or anything where I'm like, I could show it to my kids and they'd probably be freaked the fuck out by it and be scared of the dark like they always are.
But top 10 jump scare, I think I'm on the money with that. I think it's one of the best. It's still to this day. I love
it's that. It's a great scare. It's just a great scare. Like there's not a lot where I'm like, I knew where you were going already. I was like, there's other scares in the movie.
Oh yeah.
That's the scare. That scare's legendary.
I love that one. All right. This next category is so perfect. Patrick, we've talked a lot about Five Nights at Freddy's and the good, the bad, and the ugly with this movie, which unfortunately for us, it seemed like there was a lot more bad than anything else. Patrick, are we just old farts for not liking Five Nights at Freddy's? Is that our problem?
Damon, I ask this almost rhetorically because I'm like, I think the jury's still out, by the way. Like I am very curious to see what week 2 numbers are like, to see if it wasn't just me. I don't think this movie was made to entertain anybody. Like I know that they intended on that when they started, but I think the end product is not entertaining on any level. And I'm curious. I don't dive deep on social media, so I don't know if there's like a huge contingent of people who are like, Five Nights at Freddy delivered exactly what I was looking for. Like exactly. Like maybe there's a weird perfect zone of demographic of age range who is like, no, that's exactly what I was looking for. Like maybe like a 13-year-old, or I don't know. I'm throwing numbers out there, but maybe there's like 12 to 14-year-olds are like, that's the exact Five Nights at Freddy I was looking for. Maybe. I don't know. And if that's the case, then the answer is yes, I'm an old fart. I don't think this is going to be entertaining for kids, and I know adults are not into it. I mean, if they are, I really email us and let us know. I got to know why you're into it, because it just didn't entertain on any level. So that's why I feel like I'm not an old fart, because I'm really trying to go on its ride. I'm like, what ride did you want to take me on? And when the ride was over, I was like, that wasn't even a ride. Like you put shoeboxes on my feet and had me walk backwards in a closet. Like none of this was a ride. So I don't think I'm an old fart for not liking it, but I think the jury's still out. If this goes on to make $1 billion, turns out Damon, you and I are just old farts.
Yeah, and listen, I understand the old fart is the one who doesn't think he's an old fart. So I understand the
Yeah,
inclination to just not call yourself an old fart. But I'm with you, because here's the thing. There are plenty of teen leaning, let's say, like not because generally speaking, you don't make a lot of children horror films. You know what I mean? Like there are
yeah,
like, there are childish, like Monsters Inc. It's not really a horror film, but you know what I mean? Like there are
right. Yeah,
tinges of that in children's movies. Coraline would be an example of a truly terrifying kids movie, something like that. But generally speaking, I can watch a film that's leaning more towards the teen audience, whether it's horror or anything else, and I can still appreciate it. And if it's well done, it's well done. Like I'd like to consider
right.
myself a savvy enough film watcher to appreciate that. I would actually say I'm further away from the other end of the spectrum for like the really hardcore Oscar films that are just really weird and like, don't necessarily have a great plot to it, and it's just like full on art house. I know you like them more, but I would say I'm closer to like the teen films than I am to art house
Yeah,
films. Because a lot of the art house films, I'm like, what the fuck was that?
you're
I
definitely
couldn't get
more
it.
totally killer than you are the Green Knight.
100%. Oh, 100%. My God, I'd rather smack myself in the face with a sledge. I'd rather axe my face like When Evil Lurks than go see the Green Knight again. Um, but yeah, like, so I don't think I'm just being an old fart by saying this movie didn't make much sense and it didn't really appeal to me on any real level. Um, here's my biggest declaration for Five Nights at Freddy's, and I'm sorry I'm saying this so bluntly, because I know there's a lot of people who do love the video game who ran out to the theater to see this adaptation, because we saw the numbers, we talked about them earlier, huge numbers. I think this is one of those video games that didn't need an adaptation. Some media, comic book, TV show, book, video game, not everything needs to be adapted into a film. Some things are better left for what they are. You know, Five Nights at Freddy's to me feels like it was a good video game that people really enjoyed. It should have stayed a video game. The Last of Us was such a rich, involved story that when they adapted it for television, it was brilliant, and we reviewed that on the show. The Last of Us was epic and amazing and one of the best shows of the year. It can be done. It absolutely can be done. But there are certain forms of media, and I would argue, listen, I'm a big comic book fan. You can look behind me. I got comic books all behind me. There's a lot of comic book movies I would say you probably shouldn't have done it. It's just not material that you can really adapt. Like I've said for years, when they adapted Spawn into a movie that was awful, it was so bad. Now I know they're trying to do it again, and I understand there's a cartoon that was actually pretty good, but that's what
Yeah,
that is. It is a and they did Invincible. I don't know if you watched Invincible on Amazon.
a little bit of it. I didn't watch all of it.
Really, really well done animated. I don't think you should ever try to do that in live action. It just wouldn't work as well. It's just not suited for live action. This is one of those forms of media where I'm like, I think it would have just been better off as a video game. I don't think you need to make a movie about Five Nights at Freddy's.
I will answer that in our next category, which, by the way, is remakes, sequels, or leave them alone because we're talking about two movies. So we'll just jump right into my thoughts on what you said there. And my thought is for Five Nights at Freddy's, it's gonna get a sequel. It's too successful not to. So that's already at like now we're just pontificating because we know it's gonna get a sequel because it just made more money than it ever was meant to make. It's Blumhouse's most successful movie to date. It's gonna get a sequel. That's already happening. I would remake this movie. You're saying it doesn't need to be made a movie. I say if you're gonna make it a movie, just make the damn video game. The video game is about jump scares. The video game is about creepy shit. They just didn't do it. They didn't do what's in the video game. Like that's the problem. The problem is that they just decided to make a bunch of extra story that didn't accentuate what is so appealing about these video games, which is like I don't want to be scared shitless by something in this abandoned kids play room, whatever the fuck they call it. Like that's what was good. That's what makes Five Nights at Freddy's the video game a sensation is the scares, and the movie lacks the scares, like completely lacks the scares. So remake it and just scare us. Cut out the fucking villainous aunt. Cut out the daughter that's a cop that wants them there but doesn't want them. Like, cut all that shit out. Cut out the dreams. Cut them out and get to the shit already. They just didn't do the video game.
Yeah. You're not wrong. I mean, you're absolutely not wrong. Like I said, I just, again, my opinion is it's like, don't bother because this just, I think it would have been better as a video game. You're not gonna
So you're saying leave it alone.
Yeah, in that regard. So I would say it there, but I agree. Like if you're gonna do it, at least do it that way. And maybe at least you get the fun and enjoyment of the action and the horror in the video game without overcomplicating the plot, which is what they did in this movie.
Yeah.
For me, I'm gonna go the other direction. I'm gonna talk about Totally Killer because Totally Killer is a movie that is absolutely primed for a sequel because time travel always has things that happen that you don't realize happened and you change the future and now you got to go back in time to fix them again. And this time maybe you travel to 1989 and her parents are in college now or some, there's some subplot they could do. Now here's where this is a weird suggestion I'm making here, Patrick. Have you seen Happy Death Day?
Yes.
Blumhouse movie, really fun. Horror comedy, it's a blast. It is Groundhog Day as a horror film. Really fun, goofy, just it's a woman who gets killed and keeps reliving the same day over and over again and she's trying to figure out who is her killer. That's simple, right? They made a sequel, Happy Death Day to You. Kind of scares me a little bit because Christopher London, the guy who made both movies, is now directing the next Scream movie. Let's hope he goes a little bit more into Happy Death Day and not as much into Happy Death Day to You. What they do in Happy Death Day to You is they try to explain the circular nature of the day that keeps repeating itself. They go into this whole subplot about science and this machine, and it just ruins it. It ruined because it didn't need to. Did they ever explain why Bill Murray kept having to relive the same day in Groundhog Day? No. He just figured a way out of it. That's all. We don't need to know why. Happy Death Day was the exact same thing, and then the sequel, they tried to overcomplicate it. We got a machine that's built, and it's a time thing machine. It keeps you stuck in a loop, and no, stop. I don't want all that. So I'm all for a Totally Killer sequel. Maybe it takes place in the 90s when her parents are a little older. Something weird happens that when they're in college. I don't know. You could do it again. It could be fun. Once again, don't overcomplicate the plot. She has to go back and do something else. Something changed when she was back there in 1987 that she didn't realize changed, and she has to go back and stop it either in that year or in some subsequent year in the years following. She killed somebody in 1987 that was gonna, whatever, some plot. But if you're gonna do it, don't overcomplicate it. Don't overthink it. Don't, overcomplicate the time travel. Don't overexplain it. Just do exactly what you did here. Something else changed. You have to go back in time and fix it because you didn't realize that you stepped on a branch that, the butterfly effect. You didn't realize you did something that changed the future, and now you need to go back and fix it because it totally fucked up someone's life. There you go. And I'd be all for that sequel. It could be fun. It could be goofy. Again, maybe you said it in the 90s. You did Totally Killer in the 80s. Maybe it's Totally Killer in the 90s, early 90s. That could be fun. Then you're into like grunge era and stuff. You're Nirvana and Pearl Jam and whatever. Like that could be fun. I'm all for that sequel as long as they don't go down the Happy Death Day to You trail, which is overcomplicating what was a fun, simple plot.
I will go one further with Totally Killer and say make it just a whole new cast, and then they go to a different era. So one could be the 90s, one could be the 70s. I mean, the 70s has its own slasher kind of, roots and stuff like that. So it's like, and that could be called Totally Killer Man, or you know what I mean? Like I don't know, there's something, whatever. But I think that's how you could sequelize this. By the way, if you do a 90s one, a 70s one, by the time those come out, that's at least minimum 4 more years. In 4 more years, we're talking about 2027. You could do Totally Killer 2000 by that time. And like it would be completely legit. And then you'd have Backstreet Boys and like, Britney Spears and shit like that. Like this franchise can at least live for another 3 sequels just doing that, where it's like take the basic premise and just put new characters in the situation. And that's fine. And again, we don't ever worry about why the time travel happens or why it works. We just get a time machine. We have a time machine person, and we go back into the past and try to keep a slasher from achieving their goal. But I think it's ripe for plenty of fun sequels.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I mean, it's fine if you don't want to bring back the characters. Do exactly what you're saying. I'm saying you could bring back the characters as long as you don't try to overcomplicate it. Don't over-explain to us why time travel. Just go with what works. You know what I mean? Like something, and like you said, do it in your thing, like where it's just a totally different cast and it's the same concept. I'm fine with that too. This is ripe for sequels if they do it the right way, and I hope. If they end up doing it, it seems like this movie did pretty well on Amazon Prime. I don't know because it's streaming, so you can never know for sure how well a movie did. But the reception was pretty good. The positive reviews were out there. Very positively reviewed film. If they do decide to make a sequel, just have fun with it because that's what made this one so much. That's what made this one so great. It was just fun.
And you're right. Don't ever try to bother explaining the mechanics of it. Like that is where you screw something up. Like just go with the premise again, and it's okay. Time travel works, folks, and we're just in.
It's Hot Tub Time Machine. I think I texted you that originally. I was like, I don't need to know why we're traveling back in time. We're just there. Okay, let's move on with it. You know what I mean? Like, do a sequel. Don't tell me why. Just get to it. Get me back to 1994, 1993, or 1982, or 76, or whatever it is, and let's just get going.
Yeah, totally kill it.
So now, Patrick, there's 2 separate questions here. Can we survive this horror film, which is one of my favorite categories we do, which is where we drop ourselves into the horror movies that we reviewed, and we ask, could we survive these horror films? Now, when it comes to Five Nights at Freddy's and Totally Killer, could you survive both, or are you dying in both? You surviving in one and getting rid of the other? How are you making it through these 2 films?
I'm surviving Five Nights at Freddy's because I'm not getting involved in all that bullshit. It's just not. It's just I don't complicate things. I'm a very simple person, and so I wouldn't engage. Like it'd be really easy to kind of circumvent all that bullshit. So I would survive Five Nights at Freddy's. I would not survive Totally Killer. I wouldn't be able to help myself. I would get into trouble in the past. I would want to dig into stuff. I would want to learn stuff, and I would lose sight of the ultimate goal. I really would, because I just it's a lifelong dream to be able to travel back in time, and I know I would get glamored by something in the past, and it would trip me up, and I would end up on the wrong end of the knife.
So I am 100% agreement with you on both movies. That doesn't always happen. Five Nights at Freddy's, I would survive for one key reason, Pat. Not because I wouldn't get mixed up into it. You're a security guard. Shouldn't you have like some sort of weapon or something? They're animatronic puppets. I don't care if they're possessed or not. Cut the fucking head off. Something. Beat it to death with a crowbar. Set it on fire. It ain't that hard. There's a plot point in this movie where the sister Abby befriends the anime. They all become friends. They build a freaking fort, which is the weirdest part of it. Like, they become friends. As soon as it happens, I would get Abby out of there. I'd be like, oh, awesome, you made new friends. I would light a match and chuck it in there and burn the place to the ground. End of story. No more animatronic ghost puppets. Done.
Yeah, all we need is to not have puppets here, and then we don't have a problem.
I will set the whole place on fire. You want to talk about losing my job? Here's how I lose my job. I set this fucking place on fire. Done.
Yeah, I won't engage in that movie. So yeah.
Now, Totally Killer. Here's why I don't survive this movie is because it's the classic 80s slasher. Sex equals death. I would be the horny teenager. I would 100% be the dumb, horny teenager who would be distracted by the temptation of doing it on the waterbed or whatever else other scenarios the people are in this movie. They're getting blowies in the haunted house. 100%, I'm going to be the dumbass that's like, sure, let's go. And there's no danger here. Sure, why not? We're going to get naked. Sure, let's go ahead and do that. And then I get a knife in my back. So I fully admit, I am the Friday the 13th dumbass who would 100% go in the woods because there's a girl in the tent. I think I'm going to get me some. So I'm going to go in the tent even though there's a masked hockey mask killer right outside the tent. Doesn't matter because I think I'm going to get a little something. 100% Totally Killer. I would 100% think I'm going to get some sex and I'd be dead.
And that concludes another edition of Damon's Sex Corner.
Yes. I'm just telling you. Like, I'm honest enough to admit I would not survive most slasher films for that reason alone. If sex equals death, I'm doomed.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. I feel the same way.
All right, Patrick, let's get to our last category, and that is, are they scary? Five Nights at Freddy's, Totally Killer. Obviously, two totally different movies. Totally Killer is more of a horror comedy. We've already said that many times. Is there anything scary about these movies?
I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think either of his movies are scary. I mean, Totally Killer really leans into comedy. Five Nights at Freddy's leans into I don't know what. Utter boredom, convolution. I'm not sure. Like, they're not scary, but let's be honest, Totally Killer leans into plenty of horror elements. Like, it's a horror movie. It's just done in a very funny fashion, but it's got all the elements that you need for a horror. It's a slasher movie. It's 100% a slasher. So on that surface, or at least to fill the requirements of a horror movie, of a scary movie, it absolutely is. But Five Nights at Freddy's, for its cool animatronic robots, which are, by the way, done by Jim Henson's laboratory, for as cool as those robots are, the scares are minimal to zero. So it's just not scary. It's not fun. It's not funny. That alone kind of makes it scary now that I think about it.
Yeah, I agree. The Five Nights at Freddy's is a mess. I mean, it's just an absolute utter mess. It's 2 hours that could have been 75 minutes and out the door. And it could have actually been scary. I think that's what pisses me off the most about that movie. It could have been scary. It's not, though. Totally Killer is not really scary either, although I will give credit where credit's due. There are a couple jump scares that are pretty decent, like when the killer pops out of nowhere and, does whatever. Even when the killer actually gets killed by one of the other characters with like a literal, she's dressed as a Grim Reaper and she uses her sky and then she literally stabs the guy to death and they're like, that thing's real? And she's like, my dad's the sheriff. Of course he made me a real one, which is pretty funny. But like there are a couple like, genuine like kind of jolting jump scare moments in that movie, which again, it's not really scary, but there's some fun jump scares in that movie. So
Yeah.
If we're grading on a scale, Totally Killer's like, it's here, and you can't see where Five Nights at Freddy's is down here, but yeah, it's pretty low.
Oh man. Yeah.
I
I agree.
I could have dealt with One Night at Freddy's. That would have been plenty. Let me just say it that way. I get the one
You
night
know
at
what?
Freddy's
30 minutes at Freddy's would have been fine.
20.
Just that. Yeah, that's it. You don't need much.
Yeah. All right, folks, that's our episode, our special double feature as we close out the month of October talking about Totally Killer, Five Nights at Freddy's. Totally Killer is available on Amazon Prime right now. You can watch it over there. Five Nights at Freddy's is available streaming on Peacock, and it is also in theaters right now. Want to say a big thank you to everyone that tunes in each and every week to Rewind of the Living Dead. If you got questions, comments, movies you'd like us to review, send us an email. We like hearing from you guys. rotlivingdead@gmail.com. That's rot. livingdead@gmail.com. And you can also find us on all of our own social media channels. Just search Rewind of the Living Dead on Twitter /X, Facebook, and Instagram. And you can also, find us over there, send us questions over there, comments. We love hearing from you guys on there. You can obviously find us on all of our podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. And we also have a YouTube channel. We're trying to get more subscribers over there. So if you do, please, please, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And you can always send us a message on our own personal social media channels. I am at Damon Martin, and you are?
At Director Patrick. And also I'm also at Patrick of the Living Dead on TikTok, where I'm doing micro reviews of movies that we don't end up getting to on the podcast.
And I am Damon of the Dead over on TikTok. And I actually post clips from the podcast and my own little micro reviews as well over there. So go to TikTok, Damon of the Dead, Patrick of the Dead over there.
Patrick of the Living Dead.
Patrick the Living Dead, excuse me, Damon of the Dead for me. Want to say a big thank you as always to everyone that tunes in to the show. We will see you next week for another edition of Rewind of the Living Dead. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you then.
Happy Halloween.